Welcome to the Blender Animation course. In this course, we'll be going over step by step all the different processes and tools you'll need to know in order to animate in Blender.
Give it back!
So, what is Blender? Obviously, you guys know it can do animation, which is why you're here. But I wanted to go over exactly what Blender is capable of for those who don't already know. First of all, Blender is completely free and open source, which is amazing because that means anybody has access to it. It specializes in 3D CG, which means it can do 3D animation and 3D modeling. Despite being a free software, it has been used in many professional projects, including feature films, games, TV series, and tons of other projects you can see here. But what you might not know is that it can also do video editing, compositing, painting, sculpting, visual effects, cloth, particle, fluid, and smoke simulations, 3D printing, 2D animation, and real-time rendering. Now, that's pretty impressive, but we only care about the animation aspect of it in this course. So how does it compare to other industry standard animation software like Maya? Well, Blender's animation works a little differently than other software, and I personally like it better. I've used Maya and Blender for animation in the past, and I believe Blender is far more efficient in its animation workflow. Obviously, you can get used to whichever one you use more, but Blender has a big advantage over Maya, which is the dope sheet. The dope sheet is something we'll get into later in the course. But just so you know, it's basically something that allows you to manipulate your keyframes very efficiently. In Maya, the only way to manipulate keyframes in a holistic way is with the graph editor, which is far more complex than it has to be. Maya does have a dope sheet, but hardly anyone uses it because it's incredibly inflexible. Compared to dope sheet manipulation, graph editor manipulation can slow animators down. It's worth noting that graph editor manipulation is very powerful in both Blender and Maya, but it shouldn't be necessary for the more basic tasks. Another thing Blender has over Maya is its hotkey workflow, which speeds up animators compared to Maya. It's a small difference, but it can add up over long periods of time. And one big thing Blender has over any other software is the huge community. Because Blender is such a good, free software, there are so many Blender users out there in the world that I guarantee you that any question you have has probably already been answered. And that's not to mention the amazing videos and tutorials that already exist as resources for you to learn from. One example is the Blender Fundamentals series on the Blender Foundation YouTube channel, which I made. Again, you can refer back to that at any time if you have any questions about specific parts of Blender. So hopefully you're a little less scared of Blender and you know what it is and you're ready to install it. In the next video, we'll be walking you through the exact steps on how to install Blender onto your computer. How to install Blender? Well, it's not that hard. I mean, installing Blender is easy. Since it's free and open source, all you have to do is go to blender.org/download and select the file format you want. By default, the download button will give you a .msi file, which is an installer. This works like any other software install wizard or what have you, and will usually add a desktop shortcut for you and everything. And that's pretty good already. But if you're a more advanced user, you might prefer zip files, which you can extract and then run the blender.exe file directly from the folder. This not only allows you to run several different versions of Blender separately, but also you can put Blender on a thumb drive and carry it with you to run on any computer. And I even know some PC gamers who prefer installing it via Steam, which makes it easy to keep Blender up to date. The choice is up to you. I personally recommend the default option though if you're not sure. Keep in mind that these options I mentioned are technically for Windows, but Blender also provides options for Mac and Linux. As for what version of Blender to use, for this course we'll be using Blender 2.83. It's possible that you might be downloading Blender at a point where this version number is a higher number than 2.83. This just means that they updated Blender, which they do quite often, and most of the time using the most recent version is fine. But if you run into any issues or want to avoid running into issues, feel free to go to previous versions and then click download under all previous versions. On this page, every previous version of Blender should be available for download for free, including Blender 2.83. I personally recommend 2.83 if you're watching this anytime before 2022, as 2.83 has what's called long-term support. This means the team at Blender is dedicated to keeping the version stable for productions, even as they release newer versions. Overall, it should have less bugs and crashes. If you're not sure what version to download for long-term support, you can also click the long-term support tab here, which lists download links for the most recent 2.83 release. So once you have Blender downloaded and installed, let's go ahead and open it. Once you do, you should probably see something like this. And in the next module, we'll be talking about how to understand the interface and how to navigate Blender. So once you've installed and opened Blender, you should see a window that looks like this. The first thing you might notice is the default cube, but let's focus on the panels all around the user interface and go over what each one does first. The panel where the default cube is visible in is called the 3D viewport. This is where you will be able to actually see your 3D scene, which will include your characters and environment. The top right panel will show you your outliner, a text-based overview of what objects exist in your 3D scene based on hierarchy and user set collections. The right-hand side will show you a panel of properties for various types of data, including scene data, object data, material data, and more. And at the bottom here we have our timeline, a representation of time as we play back our animation. Now, with just these panels, you can already accomplish a lot. However, there are other panels available in Blender that can help even more, depending on what task you're performing. You can easily access different panel presets using the workspace tabs at the top here. We will be using the animation workspace primarily during this course. In the next video, we'll be discussing navigation. Navigation in Blender is pretty simple. I'll start off by saying that if you already have a preferred way to navigate 3D software, you're welcome to go to Edit, Preferences, Navigation and/or Key Maps to adjust your Blender experience. In these settings, you can not only fine-tune your navigation experience, but you can also set or replace any hotkeys for practically any function in Blender. But for now, we'll be going over the default navigation settings. To start off, we'll be talking about how to adjust your viewing angle in the 3D viewport. This is done primarily by using your middle mouse button, also known as the scroll wheel, and your number pad. If you don't have a 3-button mouse, I recommend getting one, or you can change your settings in input preferences to emulate 3-button mouse. This setting will allow you to substitute the middle mouse button click with Alt left click instead. Likewise, if you don't have a number pad, there is a similar setting in your input preferences that allows you to emulate numpad. This setting will allow you to substitute the number pad numbers and plus and minus buttons with the numbers and plus minus buttons on your number row. The number pad period key, however, must be remapped manually if you don't have a number pad. This can be done under your key map settings, where you can replace the hotkey for frame selected in the 3D viewport. To navigate the viewport, you'll want to learn how to rotate, pan, and zoom your viewing angle. To rotate your viewing angle, simply press middle click and drag. This will rotate your viewing angle around a singular pivot, which we'll show you how to set later. To pan your viewing angle, which means to move side to side, simply hold Shift and then press middle click and drag. Now, this will move your viewing angle and your pivot point together. Notice how when I pan, the pivot point is no longer on the cube, but on an invisible point in the center of our view here. To zoom your viewing angle, simply scroll up and down on your scroll wheel. You can also hold Control and press middle click and drag. Now, if you ever want to set your pivot point to a specific object to make navigation a bit easier, you can do so by selecting the object of interest and pressing the period key on the numpad. But how do we select an object? Well, selection in Blender is simple. By default, you can left-click select any object in the 3D viewport. If you want to deselect something, simply left-click a spot where no object exists, or you can press the Alt-A hotkey, which will deselect all. Likewise, you can press A to select all visible objects in the scene. Now let's select our default cube again with our viewing angle somewhere far away. With our default cube selected, we can press the numpad period key, and as you can see, this will focus our viewing angle on the object selected and set our pivot point to it as well. To transform an object, you can use the Quick Tools bar on the left to move, rotate, scale, or free transform the object or objects you have selected. Clicking any of these tools will activate a gizmo that you can use, which you can left-click drag to perform the relevant transformation. For example, pressing move will allow you to drag the object along the X, Y, or Z axes, or along the viewing plane. Pretty self-explanatory as you can see. There are, however, hotkeys that make transformation a lot faster and easier in my opinion. So we'll go over those real fast. To move or translate your object, you can simply press G for grab, and the object will already begin moving with your mouse movement. You can subsequently press X, Y, or Z on your keyboard to move it along a specific axis, and you can press left-click at any time to confirm the final position, or right-click to cancel. You can also press Alt-G to return the object to its default position. To rotate your object, you can press R for rotate, and your object will already begin rotating with your mouse movement. You can also subsequently press X, Y, or Z to rotate it along a certain axis, but you can also press R again to do a free rotation, which I use a lot. Again, you can press left-click at any time to confirm the final rotation, or right-click to cancel. You can also press Alt-R to return the object to its default rotation. To scale your object, you can press S for scale, and your object will already begin scaling based on your mouse movement. You can subsequently press X, Y, or Z to scale it along a specific axis. Again, press a left-click at any time to confirm the final size you want, or right-click to cancel. You can also press Alt-S to return the object to its default scale. Now, you might be getting a little bored of looking at a cube the whole time, so let's try adding different objects. Adding objects in Blender is easy enough. Simply go to the Add menu at the top left of the viewport. Under Mesh, we have several basic shapes, known as primitives, that we can add to our scene. Let's add a monkey. Fun fact, this monkey is Blender's complex primitive that every software tends to come with, similar to the Utah teapot. Its name is Suzanne, and is often used to very quickly test various things on a complex mesh. If you prefer using hotkeys, you can also press Shift-A to add objects instead of going into the Add menu from the viewport. This will bring up an identical Add menu at your mouse cursor location. Blender also has a very important function for organization in your scene known as collections. Collections are a user-set grouping function that lets you put relevant objects into a single collection for easy organization and manipulation. By default, there is the scene collection and a single collection named collection. To move an object into a collection, simply select the object or objects you'd like to move and go to the Object menu at the top left of the 3D viewport. Then go to Collection, Move to Collection. From there, select a collection from the list. Putting an object into the scene collection is the same as putting it loose into the world, as the scene collection simply holds everything in the scene. By putting your object into the collection named Collection, you can enable or disable visibility of the collection to show or hide the objects inside that collection all at once. And the last option is New Collection, which allows you to move your selected objects into a new collection, which you can name upon creation. We'll call it Test 1. For hotkey users, you can also press M for Move instead of going into the Object menu to bring up a pop-up Move to Collection menu at your mouse cursor location. In the next video, we'll be going over how to import reference, characters, and other assets. Importing a character can be done in several ways in Blender. For starters, if you are importing a non-Blender file, such as an OBJ or FBX file, you can go to File, Import, and select your file type. However, if you want to import a character rig from a different blend file that was made for use in Blender, you can use the append function. This is found under File, Append. For this video, we'll be using the assets provided in this course. These assets should include a simple bouncy ball rig as well as a complex character rig. Let's try appending each of these. First, we'll go to File, then Append. Then we navigate to the blend file that we want to append the rig from. We'll start with the bouncy ball rig first. Once we get to the blend file, simply double-click the blend file and you'll see several folders that exist within there. We'll be appending a collection, as that's the most efficient way to grab a group of objects at once, which is what our bouncy ball rig is. Under Collection, we can simply select the collection we want to import. In the case of the bouncy ball file, it's the collection named Ball Rig. Once we've done that, you can see that the ball rig now exists in our file, perfectly intact and ready to use. Not only that, but the collection itself has been added to our outliner to keep things organized. The complex character rig can be imported with the exact same process. Linking is another version of appending rigs from a blend file, but allows you to edit the original character file as needed, updating the character in all blend files where it is being linked to. This is very helpful for studios where the characters are being updated while the animators have already started animating, but it can also be helpful for individuals working on larger projects. You are not required to learn this, but I do think it is a good option to have. To link a character, the process is very similar to appending. Simply go to File, Link, then navigate to the blend file you want to link from, go to Collection, and select the collection you want to link. This will import the entire collection into your scene, but it will present it as a single object. Reset the location of this object with Alt-G to center it in your scene. Now, you may be wondering, how do we animate the character if we can't even select the rig inside the collection? Well, to do that, all we have to do is simply proxy the rig. Now, if you're watching this in the far future, proxies may have been replaced by library overrides, but the process is very much the same. The concept is creating a local version of the rig so you can animate the linked versions of the mesh. We won't talk too much about linking in this course, so if you want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out the documentation. Now, to import an environment into Blender, you can do the exact same process as you did for character importing. Again, if it is a non-Blender file format, you can go to File, Import, File Type, and navigate to your asset. If it is a blend file format, you can go to File, Append, and navigate to your blend file, double-click the blend file, go to Collection, and select the collection you want to append. You can also use File Link instead of File Append if you don't mind not being able to transform objects within the linked collection, or if you plan on updating the environment later down the road. Reference is an important part of animation and art in general. If you ever find yourself in need of reference and don't have a way to easily look at the reference and your Blender window at the same time, you'll want to know how to import reference directly into Blender. This is a very important but simple technique that can improve your art greatly. To import reference, you have a few ways you can do it. The first way to import reference into your file is to go to File, Import, Image as Planes. This is a great feature of Blender that lets you import any image as a plane mesh object. If this option isn't available to you, make sure you have it turned on in your Preferences under Add-ons. Once you do this, your image or video file will be placed into your 3D scene, and you'll be able to manipulate it like any 3D mesh object. It will also be visible at render. Another method is to simply take your image or movie file from your File Explorer window and drag it directly into your 3D viewport. This will automatically convert your image or movie file into an empty in your scene, which you can manipulate freely as if it were an object as well. These methods are great for getting a side view reference or just having a reference to look at while you're working. However, another useful and common reference type is the camera view reference. This is a reference that sticks to your camera's viewing angle as it moves, staying in the background or foreground of your scene. To do this, you'll want to enter your camera view by selecting your camera and pressing 0 on the number pad. The easiest method is to simply drag your image or movie from your File Explorer again, but this time into your camera view. This will automatically place the image or movie as your camera background image. You can adjust your reference by going to the camera settings in the Properties tab on the right, denoted by this green camera icon. From there, go to Background Images, where you'll find settings that allow you to change the file you're referencing, place the reference in the background or foreground, change its transparency, and more. This is also the other way you can import reference into your camera view. Simply go to your camera settings, enable Background Images, press Add Image, open, and select the file by navigating to it in Blender. In the next module, we'll be going over several animation tools that you'll need to animate in Blender. Now let's talk about animation tools. In this module, we'll be going over the tools you need to understand and use for the purposes of animation in Blender. They're pretty straightforward, but don't worry if you get lost. You'll get used to them in no time once you start animating. The tools we'll be discussing are the timeline, keyframes, pose mode, the dope sheet, the graph editor, curves, and cameras. To give a quick overview, the timeline is what gives us the ability to view and understand timing for our animation. It also controls certain playback options such as frame range. Keyframes are what we use to tell the computer what poses of our character we want at different times. Pose mode is the mode we'll be using to pose the rigs, which allows us to dynamically change the pose of our character over time. The dope sheet and graph editor are two tools that help us visualize and edit our keyframes to fine-tune our animation. Curves are a more advanced form of keyframes that allow us to fine-tune the interpolation between keyframes. And cameras are what we'll be using to film and render our scene, just like a real camera. In the next video, I'll be teaching you how to make a simple bouncy ball animation to help you get familiar with the timeline and setting keyframes. While I could jump into the animation tools and explain the settings, I know some of you are new to animation as a whole. So I'll be explaining the concept of animation while showing you guys how the timeline works. The timeline is how the software interprets time in our scene. It is the foundation of how animation works in Blender. It provides simple tools for navigating, editing, and viewing the frames of our animation. To start off, let's see what happens when we hover our mouse over the 3D viewport and press spacebar. As you can see, our timeline starts moving, visualizing the passage of time within our 3D scene. Spacebar is the hotkey that allows us to play our animation back whenever we want to see it in action. We can also press the play button at the bottom here. Now, to showcase exactly what the timeline does, let's try to make a quick bounce animation with our cube here. Except instead of a cube, let's use a ball. So let's delete this cube with the delete key or X hotkey, and then use the add menu to bring in a UV sphere. I'm also going to right-click it and select Shade Smooth. One feature of the timeline that makes animation very easy is this white circle button, which turns on auto keyframe mode. By clicking this, we can start transforming our ball freely, and keyframes will be automatically added for us. Since we're doing a bouncing animation, let's go ahead and move it up along the Z-axis. As you can see, this creates a diamond-shaped keyframe at our current frame on the timeline. Another way to insert keyframes manually is by right-clicking the object and going to Insert Keyframe, Lock Rot Scale. For hotkey users, you can also press I, as in Insert, to access the same menu. Now, in order to create an animation, we need at least two keyframes, one for the starting position and one for an ending position. Let's insert another keyframe for the ball to interpolate to. But creating another keyframe on the current frame simply overwrites our first keyframe. So we're going to want to move our current frame to a later frame in the timeline first. How do we do that? Well, to go to a specific frame, you can actually change your current frame manually here. But there are a few more options. We can also left-click drag the top bar of the timeline where the frame numbers are labeled to scrub through to a specific frame, or hold Alt and use the scroll wheel. Now with this, we can move our current frame to frame 10 and move our ball again to insert another keyframe. But where should we move our ball? Well, since it's supposed to be bouncing, let's bring it back to the ground for this frame. We can do that easily by pressing Alt-G to bring it back to the origin, and then move it up just a bit so it's above the grid. Great! As you can see, we have automatically inserted a new keyframe on frame 10 as well. Since we have 2 keyframes now, in theory, our ball should be animated. And at this point, you might be interested to see what that looks like. As we tried earlier, we can press spacebar to play the animation. So let's do that. But for some reason, there isn't any movement for our ball. That's because the play button starts playing your animation from your current frame, and our animation starts at the beginning. As you can see, once your current frame reaches the end of the frame range, your playback will loop back to the start frame and continue playing. Nice, it does look like we have a basic downwards motion. But I really don't like waiting that long to see it loop, so let's adjust the loop region. To do that, we can edit our start and end frames of our playback range on the right of the timeline here. This playback range is marked by the dark gray regions before and after the start and end frames respectively. Let's bring our end frame down to frame 40. This makes our loop region appear a bit too small, but we can actually zoom in to our timeline with the scroll wheel. If you need to also pan your timeline, simply middle click drag, or hold Ctrl and use your scroll wheel. Nice, now we can continue animating. Real quick, let's add 2 more keyframes to finish our bounce animation. I'm going to add a keyframe on frame 15 where the ball bounces up just slightly. This is going to be like a really heavy bowling ball or something, so it won't bounce very high. Then on frame 20, we'll simply want the ball to be on the ground again. We can insert a new keyframe and try to eyeball it. However, that's not super efficient since we'll be doing the same pose twice. And it won't even be exactly the same. So let's delete that frame 20 keyframe real quick. To delete keyframes, simply select them, right-click for a context menu, and select Delete Keyframes. You can also simply press X or the delete key. So to copy a keyframe from another frame, in this case frame 10, we can actually duplicate the keyframe on frame 10 and drag it over to frame 20. To do this, you can simply select the keyframe we want to copy, right-click for a context menu, and select Duplicate. Then move the duplicated keyframe to frame 20 and left-click to confirm. For hotkey users, you can press Shift-D. Let's play back our animation now to see our masterpiece. Well, it's got the right poses, but it isn't really bouncing, but rather just moving up and down. How do we fix this? Well, by default, Blender interpolates the keyframe poses with an ease in and ease out motion, slowly transitioning the velocity of the object between poses. This is usually great, but for us it's working against our goals. In our case, we want the ball to be moving the fastest when it hits the ground. Luckily, Blender allows us to change different aspects of the interpolation curve to fix issues like this very easily. To make the bounces sharper and more sudden, we can simply select the keyframes at frame 10 and frame 20 and select the handle type from our right-click context menu. What is handle type? Well, we'll go over handle types in more detail in the graph editor and dope sheet videos. However, just know that if we select vector, our curves for the bounce should be fixed. For hotkey users, you can also press V to bring up the handle type menu. As you can see, we now have a bouncy bouncing ball. Congratulations, you've made a quick bouncing ball animation in Blender. But what if we wanted to slow it down a bit? Let's pretend it's going in slow motion. Luckily, with our timeline's basic keyframe manipulation features, that's easy. Simply select all the keyframes in your timeline by pressing A. Then you can bring your current frame back to the beginning and hit S to scale your keyframes outward from your current frame. As you can see, our keyframes are spacing out more and more as we drag our cursor. We can also type a number during this process to specify an amount to scale by. I'm going to type the number 2 and press enter to double the scale of our keyframes. This will space out our keyframes to be twice as far away from each other, thus making the animation twice as long and twice as slow. So, we've gone over the basic timeline features that are required to create an animation. Now, we're going to switch gears a bit and pretend that we're animating and the viewport starts to lag. You might also see a red number here during playback. This red FPS number means that your current playback speed is less than the actual FPS, or frames per second, marked in your render settings. There will be cases like this where our scene is so heavy that our playback won't be able to keep up. This will mess up a lot of our timing and speed, as we might end up rendering and find out the actual playback FPS is much faster. To solve this, we'll want to go to the playback options on the left side of the timeline. Open this menu by left-clicking and go to the No Sync drop-down menu. By default, No Sync simply means that Blender is prioritizing displaying every frame in the viewport instead of prioritizing playing the animation back in real time. This is typically good for seeing your whole animation without missing details, but not that great for timing purposes. If you want your FPS and your playback speed to synchronize, even at the cost of dropping a few frames here and there, you'll want to change this from no sync to frame dropping. Once you've done this, you'll notice that when you play your animation back, the viewport will still have a red FPS number, but it will be skipping frames now and then so that the position of your current frame matches where your current frame would be if your playback FPS was real time. If you're wondering what AV Sync is, it stands for Audio Visual Sync, and its functionality is very much the same. It also drops frames, but prioritizes synchronizing your viewport playback with your audio playback, which you can import into the video editor timeline, but we'll go over that in a future video. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of how the timeline works for animation. In the next video, I'll be going over armatures and how to use pose mode to animate characters. Pose mode is the mode we'll have to familiarize ourselves with in order to start animating complex character rigs. If you take a look at the character rigs that have been provided in this course, you'll notice that they have what are called armature objects surrounding them. These armatures are also known as rigs and can be used to deform the character mesh using bones so that it looks natural. For example, transforming or rotating an object as a whole will not allow you to bend elbows or knees, but using the rig allows the character to start deforming in a way that feels like a character with joints. To learn more about pose mode, I'm going to go into our actual character files. You're free to follow along. You may notice at first, when trying to select the individual joints in the armature, Blender doesn't let you. This is because we're in object mode, which only allows you to select objects as a whole. In order to move the bones, we have to use pose mode. This can be done by simply selecting our armature object in object mode, and then selecting pose mode from the drop-down menu at the top left of the viewport. Hotkey users can also use Ctrl-Tab. This will change the color of our armature to begin representing the individual colors of each bone. Typically bones will be blue by default, but some rigs have custom colors to make it easier for the animators to identify. Once we have the armature in pose mode, we can select each bone individually and begin transforming them freely as we would if they were an object. Keep in mind that some bones may be connected to their parent bones, and thus cannot be translated but only rotated. But other than that, it should work exactly the same as other transformations in Blender. You can use G for grab, R for rotate, and S for scale. Combine bone transformation with the timeline and adding keyframes, and suddenly you're doing character animation. Now, for veteran animators, you may be wondering if there is onion skinning for 3D animation in Blender, and at the time of recording this, it is not available natively in Blender. However, there is a third-party add-on that you can buy and download that allows for onion skinning in Blender 2.8. There is onion skinning for 2D animation in Blender though, but that's using the grease pencil, which we'll go into later. Coming up next is the video discussing the dope sheet, one of the most essential tools in Blender for animation. Now, the timeline we already know can edit keyframes to an extent, but the dope sheet is like a more powerful version of the timeline when it comes to keyframe editing. I believe that the dope sheet is the most important tool for animation in Blender, and that most of the animation editing you typically need to do can be done through the dope sheet alone. But what is the dope sheet? Well, the dope sheet is a keyframe manipulation tool that you can use to drag keyframes, scale them, retime them, delete them, etc. So let's see how to use it. To access the dope sheet, you can technically create a new panel in your current workspace by right-clicking, selecting Split Area, and left-clicking to confirm. Then selecting the dope sheet editor from the editor drop-down menu. Alternatively, however, we can simply go to the animation workspace, and the dope sheet will be provided for you at the bottom instead of the timeline. This is what we'll be using. As you already know from the timeline video, Blender lets you select and transform keyframes in various ways. These methods of keyframe manipulation all work in the dope sheet as well: selecting, deleting, moving, scaling, etc. Additional keyframe selection options also exist under the Select menu. Let's go ahead and make some keyframes for our object so we can see what this looks like. Just like our timeline video, let's once again animate a simple bouncing ball. But this time, let's use the ball rig that we have included in this course, so we can also apply how to use pose mode. To import the ball character rig, let's simply go to File, Append, then navigate to our Assets Blend file, go to Collection, and select Ball Rig. Once in our scene, we can select our ball's armature object and go to Pose mode, then turn on Auto Keyframe. To deform the ball, we'll select the main ball bone and start transforming to set keyframes. We'll set a keyframe for a high pose on the first frame, go to frame 10 to set a low pose where it's touching the grid, set a much lower high pose on frame 15, and duplicate frame 10 to frame 20 for our final low pose. This is all very similar to our timeline video exercise. Excellent. Now we can go ahead and change our handle type for our extreme low poses on frame 10 and 20. This will once again give us that bouncing ball look. We can also bring our end frame back to 40 for a shorter playback loop time. Now, let's pay attention to our keyframes here. Unlike the timeline, our dope sheet provides a little bit more visual information about our keyframes. For example, each of these keyframes is a different shape based on the handle type. By default, in fact, our keyframes are no longer diamond, but rather round circles. Circle means the handle type is auto-clamped, which is the default ease in, ease out, while square means vector. Feel free to test what shapes the other handle types are. Additionally, you can also change the interpolation mode of your keyframes by pressing T or selecting one under the right-click context menu. When would you want to do this? Well, one of the most common interpolation modes, besides the default Bezier mode, is the constant interpolation mode. This is used most often for blocking an animation, turning off interpolation entirely so you can focus on your keyframes. We'll go over the process of blocking once we begin animating for our parkour scene later. But one thing you may have noticed is that we have far more keyframes here vertically than we did for the timeline. This is because the dope sheet separates and displays the different parent keyframes that can be expanded, giving us individual control over things such as the X location or Z rotation of an object. Keep in mind that selecting and transforming the parent keyframe will select and or transform all keyframes that belong to that group. Quick tip: to select all keyframes in a single column from any row, you can hold Alt and left click. Now, the channels we see here are determined by what object we have selected. But what if we wanted to see every keyframe in our scene from every object? To do that, we can simply change the settings here, which determines what keyframes to display. By default, this arrow icon is enabled, meaning that the dope sheet will only display keyframes of the objects you have selected. However, we can also toggle this off, allowing the dope sheet to display all keyframes of all currently visible objects. To also include hidden objects, simply toggle on the middle option with the dotted line cube icon. This will include any objects in collections that are currently hidden. However, it does not include objects in collections that have been unchecked. In case you ever get lost in the sea of keyframes or really need to zoom out quickly to see all of your keyframes, simply hover over the dope sheet and press Home. You can also go to View, View All. Now, let's talk about a few more advanced dope sheet features that will be able to help us for our animation workflow. For starters, the View menu will give us several different functions and tools. The Show Sliders option is a great one that displays the values of each keyframe as a slider that you can adjust and animate very easily, all in one place. Without this turned on, you would need to go to wherever each channel is displayed, anywhere in the UI, to change its value directly. This also removes the need to go into the graph editor for every small adjustment, but we'll talk about the graph editor in another video. The Show Curve Extremes option also allows you to very quickly see the direction the motion of the curve is turning when it changes direction. For example, with our Y location channel, you can see based on these new icons that our curve is bending downwards for these frames and bending back upwards for these frames. If the curve is straight or simply exists between two curve extremes, it will not be marked as a curve extreme. But you might be wondering, what is a curve and why do we keep talking about it when we're only looking at dots and straight lines here? That's a great question. The curves we're referring to are the interpolation curves that can be seen and edited directly in the graph editor. You can actually very easily enter the graph editor from the dope sheet by going to View, Toggle Graph Editor. Hotkey users can press Ctrl-Tab while hovering over the dope sheet to toggle between the graph editor and the dope sheet at any time. In the graph editor, you'll be able to see the curves clearly, showing exactly how the interpolation modes look and what curve extremes look like. In some software, the graph editor takes dominance as the keyframe manipulator, even basic keyframe manipulation, due to the absence of a powerful dope sheet. However, in Blender, with the dope sheet that it has, much of the basic keyframe manipulation can be done very easily without sifting through complex curves. But the graph editor can be very helpful for advanced tweaking and visualization. We'll talk more about the graph editor in the next video. The graph editor is the most advanced keyframe manipulator when it comes to 3D animation. Compared to the dope sheet, the graph editor can do many of the same things, but also allows the user to view and edit the motion curves directly. Let me show you what I mean. I'll assume that you've already followed the instructions for animating the ball rig in the previous dope sheet video, which will give us some keyframes to test things out with. That being said, let's go ahead and go into our graph editor. In case you missed it earlier, you can easily toggle between the graph editor and the dope sheet by pressing Ctrl-Tab while hovering over the dope sheet. You may have noticed by now that our keyframes in the graph editor are represented by orange handles along the curves we see displayed. Another thing you may have noticed is that the handles are different for the frames where we had to set the handle type to vector, where the ball touches the ground. To show this more clearly, let's go ahead and set the handles back to their default handle types. We can do this very quickly by selecting all the handles in the graph editor with the A hotkey and then pressing V auto clamped. Now that we've done that, let's try to set those handles back to vector using only the graph editor. First, let's locate again the frames that we want to set the handles to vector for that bouncy feel. This should be frames 10 and 20. However, selecting these keyframes becomes a bit difficult, since each handle represents a separate channel of a keyframe. If we want to select all handles on a single keyframe, we'll want to hold Alt before clicking the handle we want. This acts similarly to selecting a column of keyframes in the dope sheet. So for this, we'll go ahead and Alt-click any handle on frame 10, and Shift-Alt-click any handle on frame 20. Then we'll press V, Vector. As you can see, the handles have changed visually this time, accurately showing how the animation will be interpolated. Unlike the dope sheet and timeline, the graph editor directly shows you what changing the handle type looks like in terms of the interpolation curves. We can then play our animation with spacebar to confirm that we did it right. Now, let's observe our graph editor a little more closely to see how similar and how different it is from the dope sheet. Before we move on, I want to say that in case your graph editor is too zoomed in or you can't see all of your keyframes, simply hover over the graph editor and press Home. You can also go to View, View All. The first similarity we'll notice is the left-hand column. Just like the dope sheet, the keyframes have all been assigned to specific channels. You can expand and collapse channels by clicking the arrow or using the plus or minus keys on the number pad while hovering over the channels. However, you might notice that while the channels are listed, there are no rows of keyframes to see which keyframes belong to which channels. In fact, our keyframes have all been transformed into curves, so what do keyframes even look like in the graph editor? Well, keyframes are indicated by the orange handles we've already talked about. You can see them spread out along the curves. And each curve belongs to a channel. To show this, simply left-click any of the channels on the left to highlight the corresponding curve in the graph. To isolate a curve, you can left-click to select it, go to the Channel menu and select Hide Unselected Curves. For hotkey users, you can press Shift-H. This will hide all other curves for you. To unhide all the curves, simply go back into the Channel menu and select Reveal Curves. For hotkey users, you can press Alt-H. Now, let's go ahead and isolate only the location curves and try to manipulate our keyframes and curves using the graph editor. As you can see, each of the keyframes in each channel exists on their respective curves as these orange handles, which we can select and transform using the same selection and transformation options we typically have in Blender. I'm going to simply shift left click a few of these keyframes and start using G, S, and R to transform them. As you can see, moving, rotating, and scaling keyframes are all possible in the graph editor, allowing for very versatile and intuitive transformation of the curves. But what if we select a single handle? Each handle by itself is technically made up of 3 selectable parts: the main body and the 2 handlebars. By default, the endpoints of each handlebar can be transformed as a way to rotate the handle and manipulate the length of the handles, which affect how the curve interpolates between keyframes. You can also select the body and use R or S to rotate or scale both handlebars simultaneously. However, handle transformation differs depending on what handle type we use. For example, the vector handle types we have at the extreme low poses for our ball can be edited individually on each side. It also can't be rotated, as vector handle types must point to the previous and next keyframes. Quick note, when you break an individual handlebar off of its default orientation of auto-clamped by rotating it or dragging it, it will convert the keyframe handle type to aligned. Aligned is when both handlebars are moving together, whereas free is where each handlebar moves independently. Feel free to experiment with other handle types. Another thing we talked about is the interpolation modes. Interpolation modes can also be very easily changed in the dope sheet and timeline, but we never talked about what they look like in the graph editor. Since the graph editor is composed specifically of interpolated curves, the interpolation mode greatly affects how the interpolated curves look. Let's try a few by isolating the Z location curve and selecting all the keyframes by pressing A. We can then go to the keyframe menu, go to interpolation mode, and select constant. As you can see, the constant interpolation mode removes all curve interpolation and simply repeats the previous keyframe's value until it encounters another keyframe. If this looks like a familiar pattern to you, it might be because you saw it in the interpolation mode menu for constant. As you can see, each of the interpolation modes has an icon that represents what the curves look like when in that mode. Feel free to test out these modes to better understand them. Bezier, however, is the default, and we'll be changing ours back to Bezier for now. Now that we've gotten basic curve manipulation out of the way, let's talk about more advanced curve manipulation options, specifically curve modifiers. Curve modifiers are extremely powerful, non-destructive functions that can help you alter and adjust your curves. There are a few, but to demonstrate this, I'm going to show you how to use the noise curve modifier. To add curve modifiers, simply open the right-hand side menu in the graph editor. You can do this by clicking the arrow icon on the right or pressing N. From this right-hand side menu, go to the Modifiers tab. Make sure you have the curve you want to modify selected. We'll go ahead and select our Z location curve by clicking on the Z location channel on the left-hand side. Then we can go into the Add Modifier drop-down menu and select Noise. For hotkey users, you can hover over the graph editor and press Ctrl-Shift-M and select Noise from that menu. Immediately, you can see how the noise modifier affects our curve, as the curve now has a noise pattern added all throughout it. If we play our animation back, we can see that a slight shaking effect has now been added on top of our original animation. Even if we set new keyframes or move them around, the shaking effect adjusts to the curve dynamically. Just like mesh modifiers, we can also adjust the modifier settings to change how the modifier affects our curve. Feel free to experiment with each modifier's settings to understand them better. But these two options at the bottom are important to try as well. If we expand the Restrict Frame Range option, we can see a start and end range that we can set. This will allow us to restrict the effect of the modifier to specific frames along our curve. Additionally, the in and out frames will allow us to fade the modifier influence in or out a certain number of frames. For example, if I set the fade in value to 10, the curve modifier will slowly fade the influence of the effect over the course of 10 frames. Furthermore, you can also manually adjust the influence slider below that under Use Influence. Collapsing either of these options will also disable them. In the graph editor, wrench icons represent curve modifiers, but the only time you see this icon is next to the channel names. That's because this wrench icon is used to toggle on and off curve modifiers for that specific curve for your convenience. Similarly, the checkbox disables the curve's value from affecting the object at all, and the lock icon prevents changes to be made on that curve. I hope this video helped explain what the graph editor can do, what curves are, and how you can use the F-curve modifiers to help you animate. In the next video, we'll be going over cameras in Blender, how to use them, and what they can do. To create a camera, simply add a camera via the Add Objects menu. This can be done in the top left of the 3D viewport or the Shift-A hotkey. However, you'll notice that by default, if there's already an active camera in the scene, we can't seem to look through our new camera. To look through our new camera, we'll have to set it as the active camera. We can do this by selecting the new camera and pressing the hotkey Control Numpad 0. You can also go to View, Cameras, Set Active Object as Camera, or set the camera via the Scene Properties tab here. Now, if we press the Numpad 0 hotkey or go to View, Cameras, Active Camera, you'll be able to look through our newly created camera. Some of the other important features of a camera can be found in the camera data settings. To look at these settings, simply select the camera object and click the green camera data icon in the Properties tab. Here we can see settings such as focal length, clip start and clip end, and depth of field. Feel free to experiment with these three settings as they'll be important to your camera filming experience. Focal length lets you zoom in and out with the camera. Clip start and clip end sets the distance for the camera's visible range, excluding everything outside of the range from render. Depth of field is a bit more complex, so we'll be going over that specifically in a later video. In the next module, I'll finally be teaching you how to create a run cycle using the character provided in this course. Now let's finally get started in doing some real character animation. This will be our introduction to animation and how to start applying the principles and tools we learned how to use earlier. For this, we'll be doing a simple run cycle with the more advanced character rig provided in this course. Let's start from the very beginning. First things first, let's go ahead and open up Blender. Once here, we're going to go ahead and enter the animation workspace, which is where we'll be doing most of our work. Since we want to animate with our advanced character rig, we're going to go ahead and delete our default cube and import our character rig with the append function. So let's just select our cube, press delete or X, and then go to File, Append. Then we can navigate to our blend file, double click it and go into Collection, and then select Character Rig. Our character Abby should now be successfully imported into our scene. Let's go ahead and hide anything we don't need by pressing the eyeball icon in the outliner. Then we'll go ahead and select our armature object for Abby and press Ctrl Tab to go into pose mode. And that's it. We're practically ready to start animating. But before we do, we'll be going over the controls for the rig first. I won't be going over every bone since most of them should be pretty self-explanatory. For example, the torso is the torso, the chest is the chest, the head is the head, etc. But we will be going over the less obvious control bone functions that most character rigs will have. This rig that you see was created using Rigify, which is a default add-on that comes with Blender. The rig comes with several great tools, but one of the most common tools you'll want to familiarize yourself with that you'll see in most rigs is the inverse kinematics function. This is built into most rigs via constraints and bones, but all you need to know as an animator is how to use it. Rigify comes with a very powerful Rig UI, which you can access in the right-hand side toolbar. However, if you don't see it, you can simply enter the scripting workspace, select abbyui.py from the text editor dropdown, and hit the Run Script button over here. You can then go back to your animation workspace again, and it should now be visible. Inverse kinematics is the opposite of forward kinematics. So let me explain what forward kinematics is first. I'll demonstrate with Abby's arm here. Feel free to watch, there's no need to follow along for this part. By default, bones use forward kinematics, which is when you have a chain of bones where each bone follows the transformations of their parent bone. For example, if you want to move the upper arm, the lower arm and hand bones will move along with it. Likewise, if you move the lower arm, the hand will move with it, but the upper arm stays put. Forward kinematics is a fancy way of saying that the movement of the bones only affects the bones ahead of them in the chain, not behind them. So if you wanted to animate someone raising their hand from this pose, you would have to first move the upper arm, bend the forearm, and then move the upper arm again and straighten the forearm like so. However, with inverse kinematics, you can set the rig up to allow bones from the bottom of the chain to affect bones higher up in the chain. This is usually set for the hands or feet and allows you to move the hand to affect the entire arm's pose. So in the example of the raised hand, you could simply move a single bone to both bend the arm and straighten the arm to raise the hand instead of transforming two bones. In some cases, inverse kinematics, or IK, will be the preferred way to animate. And in other cases, forward kinematics, or FK, will be the preferred way to animate. Knowing the difference will help you as an animator determine which one will make it easier for you. Another great example where IK might be necessary is the feet. When you want to animate something simple such as crouching, if you have FK and you move the torso down, you'll notice that the legs will simply go through the ground unless you painstakingly match the feet to the ground level by moving the thigh, the shin, and the foot bones separately. However, if you use IK, you get a very natural crouching motion without much work, as the feet drive the bending of the knees instead of the other way around. To switch between these modes for the hands and feet, simply select any of the relevant bones, such as the hand IK or hand FK bones, and you'll see an FK IK slider on the right-hand side toolbar. Slide this to 0 or 1 to choose which mode you'd like to use. And you can even keyframe this value to switch between the modes dynamically throughout your animation. In the next video, we'll be making our first pose for our run cycle. Okay, so let's start animating. We will be animating a simple run cycle with this character to get us used to animation and to use this animation later in our parkour sequence. Before we begin, it's always a good idea to gather reference. I've included some reference in the course files for you to use, but you can also look up reference online or record your own reference if there's something specific you want to animate. To import reference, I'll simply be dragging in the images and movies from my file explorer directly. This lets me place the reference in my 3D scene, and I'll be placing it right behind my character, as well as to the side of my character. Let's make our first pose. All we have to do is look at our reference and choose what pose we want to start the run cycle with. I typically prefer starting it with the pose where the legs are the widest apart, since it's the most dynamic pose to look at. Let's take a look at our reference here and match the pose that we see. I'm going to press Ctrl Numpad 3 and Numpad 5 to go into side orthographic view. You can also press the red axis on this gizmo here, and press this grid icon to go into orthographic mode. If you want to confirm that you're in this view as well, check the top left-hand corner of the viewport. Feel free to toggle between front and side view while you reference the pose. Now we can just match this pose by going into pose mode and selecting and transforming the bones necessary. This process consists mostly of left-clicking to select and pressing R or G to rotate or translate the bones respectively. If you want to use IK or FK, make sure you set that before you start posing. Personally, I like working in IK, so I'll be using IK for the feet and the hands. And there we go. We have our first pose. If you remember from before, all we need to create an animation is at least 2 keyframes. But we haven't actually inserted any keyframes yet. That's because I haven't turned on auto keyframe. However, I typically like to add a keyframe for every bone at the start of an animation so that I know it will look exactly how I posed it. Let's do that by pressing I and then selecting Whole Character. This will set a keyframe for every bone and property in the rig. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and turn on the auto keyframe feature for future keyframes, which is how I usually work. However, if you prefer setting keyframes manually, you're welcome to use the I hotkey or right-click the 3D viewport to set keyframes. Ultimately, it's just down to personal preference. Now, before we start the arduous process of animation, I should mention that there are 12 principles of animation, which you may have heard of. But you don't need to know all of them before you start. So we'll be mentioning certain principles as we use them, but if you would like to review the 12 principles, Bloop Animation has a course called the Animation Foundations course. In the next video, we'll be adding more keyframes to set our key poses. So let's go ahead and start adding more keyframes to this animation. To do that, we'll want to first change our current frame so as not to overwrite our first pose. Now at this stage, some animation teachers might tell you that choosing exactly what frame to put your next pose on is very important for timing. But in Blender that's not really true, since manipulating frames is made so easy with the dope sheet, we can simply go to a frame that feels nice and adjust or retime it very easily later. I recommend turning off Selected Only and turning on Show Hidden Objects in your dope sheet settings. I'm going to start with frame 0, and then space our first 2 poses out by 5 frames. Then choose frames in between each pose to add our first 5 key poses. The reason why I'm stopping at 5 is so that I stop at the halfway point where my character has reached a mirrored version of the first pose. At that point, it's more efficient to copy and mirror the poses you've already done to finish the run cycle than to pose them from scratch. We'll go over that process after this. So for now, on our 5th key pose on frame 10, it should be a mirrored version of frame 0. But go ahead and try to match the mirrored pose as best you can manually first, and we'll go over how to properly mirror it in the next video. But while I'm making these poses, and while you're making these poses, you'll probably want to use the Insert Whole Character keyframe option for each one anyway, even if you're using auto keyframe for now. I typically do this for the first few poses so I get a solid base. Another thing that you might prefer is to change the interpolation mode for the key poses. Once you start doing playback for these poses, you might notice that they sort of drift distractingly between each pose, and it doesn't look very good. That's to be expected since we don't have every pose we need just yet, but sometimes this interpolation can be distracting to the animator when trying to figure out if the pose feels right or not. To turn off all interpolation for our keyframes, we simply have to select all of our keyframes in the dope sheet with the A hotkey, press T, and select Constant. This lets us see the character snap to and hold each pose, which makes it more obvious to us if it feels right. Here you can see me adjusting poses that I forgot to match to the front view. Another thing you'll want to keep in mind is not to move the torso forward or backwards. You can see here I'm adjusting the torso's Y translation to go back to 0 because I accidentally moved it forward on an earlier pose. This is just how run cycles and walk cycles usually work. You want to only move it up and down because the forward and backward movements should be defined by the feet. Alright, so we finished our first 5 key poses. The next video will be about pose mirroring, which will help us finish the rest of the key poses very quickly. Pose mirroring is made very easy in Blender compared to other software. If you want to mirror a pose, simply copy the pose with Ctrl+C. You want to make sure that all the bones are selected while the character is in pose mode and that your mouse is hovering over the 3D viewport. This will copy the transformations of the bones, which you can then paste back onto the rig. We can see this in action if we move to a different frame and try pasting the pose while in pose mode with Ctrl+V. However, this only copies the pose. Let's undo that since that was just for a demonstration. If we wanted to paste a mirrored version of that pose, all we have to do is press Shift-Ctrl+V. This pastes the same pose, but mirrored. And that's it. You just copy and paste while holding Shift and you got a mirrored pose. So let's go ahead and use this by going to frame 0, copying our first pose, and then going to frame 10 and pressing Shift-Ctrl+V to get a perfectly mirrored version of our first pose. Look at that. That's so much easier than manually mirroring the pose. So let's go ahead and repeat this process for the other 3 poses. You'll want to make sure that the keyframes you copied have the same relative spacing. And for me, I've made sure that my first half ended at frame 10 so that the math would be a bit easier. Frame 3 goes to frame 13, frame 5 goes to frame 15, etc. Rinse and repeat until we come full circle and our character arrives back at the first pose. After we do that, let's make sure to match our end frame with the last keyframe on our timeline. And now we have a cycle. It's not finished, but it's there, and we can play it back to view the beginnings of our first animation in Blender. Now, the purpose of key poses is to help with timing. So let's take a look at our animation here and judge whether or not we should speed up or slow down certain parts of it, or the whole thing. This can be done very easily through the dope sheet. For me, I figured out some timings before this so that it works pretty well. But if you want to change it, it's easy to move keyframes around, scale them, and retime them. The trick with run cycles is that you don't want the body to move faster during one part than another, especially the feet, which you want to move at a pretty constant rate. So you'll want to time that properly if you can. The best way to adjust timing in the dope sheet is to make sure that the selected only icon is off and the show hidden objects icon is on. This will make sure that all the keyframes are visible so you're moving the entire pose at once instead of accidentally just moving one bone. And that's it for our key poses. If done correctly, you should already see the beginnings of a run cycle. In the next video, we'll be finishing the run cycle by adding in-betweens and turning back on Bezier interpolation for our curves. This process is known as splining. The rest of the animation process involves adding poses in between our key poses until it feels complete. This can be done with full body poses or body part specific poses. I personally like to do a combination of both, so we'll just go ahead and start working at that. Make sure to use reference for this part so you get a good feel of what it should look like and how to adjust your animation accordingly. For that, I'm going to go ahead and drag my movie file here into my scene, which will add it as an empty as before. We'll go ahead and hide the old reference real quick so we can get this one. And I'm going to go ahead and also duplicate it so we get the front view behind the character for our convenience. You'll also notice that my empty seems to move away all of a sudden. This is because my auto keyframe is on and it keyframed different positions for different frames. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure to delete those keyframes on those empties. For this process, I typically turn Bezier interpolation back on so that I can adjust the animation slowly until it looks right. This is known as the splining process, as it uses the Bezier spline interpolation as opposed to the constant interpolation. All I'm doing here is trying to match up the poses with the reference as best I can, but paying attention to specific body parts, not setting a whole body keyframe. The reason for that is because I want to try to keep my arcs clean. Arcs are basically the motion path that a bone takes, and you don't want it to jitter too much, so you want it to be going along a relatively smooth path. If you have too many keyframes, you're more likely to have a jittery path, because you're not letting the computer interpolate things smoothly. Because we're no longer working with whole character keyframes, I like to turn on the selected only icon in the dope sheet. This will clean up my dope sheet a little bit so that it's not too difficult to read. For the most part, you'll be matching the reference as best you can. However, you'll want to also use some intuition based on how it moves and compare the animation and motion, not just the poses. I encourage you to do this to start thinking like an animator. Another thing that I'm doing is I'm copying any pose that I edit and I like the look of to the other side 10 frames later, or 10 frames before, depending on which side I edit first. I'm doing this to make sure that my run cycle still looks symmetrical. However, if you want to just edit one side, for example the first 10 frames first, you could do that and then paste the frames from the first 10 frames onto the second 10 frames like we did earlier, but for the whole run cycle. You'll notice in some parts of this time-lapse, I go into the graph editor. This allows me to smooth the curves and the arcs, as I said earlier, very quickly. It also allows me to scale the keyframes vertically in case I want to lower or increase the amplitude of these curves. This means I can make my hip, for example, go higher or lower, or have it not move up and down as much at all. Using the graph editor is one of the best ways to edit animation as a whole instead of pose by pose. Also, just a tip so you can view your animation without any clutter, you can click this icon in the top right hand corner to hide all overlays. This will hide the empties as well as your character's rig, which will let you see the character without any distractions. Simply press the same icon again to toggle it back on. For hotkey users, you can press Shift-Alt-Z. To view a more accurate playback speed for your animation, I recommend changing your playback options from no sync to frame dropping. The only downside to this is that it does skip frames, so if there is a single frame that looks off, you may not see it every time. Of course, you can still view and edit every frame manually by scrubbing the timeline, it's just the playback that will skip some frames. A few tips I have to do with understanding some principles of animation, namely follow-through and overlapping action. This is a fancy way of saying inertia. Whenever you have things moving, usually there is a main driving force of the momentum, and then everything else follows that momentum to an extent. So for this example, in a run cycle, the torso or hip or center of gravity, whatever you want to call it, is the main momentum driver, moving the character up and down slightly. We can use this information by having the head lag behind slightly when moving up with the chest, giving the head some weight like it would have in real life. Just don't overdo it because we don't want their head to look too floppy either. This is the fun part, and also the hard part. So hopefully you have some fun with experimenting with poses and getting the animation you want to see out of it. But if you ever need more resources to study animation in more detail, I encourage you to learn more about the 12 principles of animation, as well as study more and more reference as you go. I also discuss a few more tips in the next video that should help you polish your animation. So you've gotten your character animation looking pretty good already. This is the part where we talk about all the little things we can do to sweeten up your animation even more. In this video, I'll be discussing a few tips that I like to follow when trying to polish my animation. This includes a few principles of animation that we talked about before, but in a bit more detail. First and foremost, let's talk about agency, aka overlapping action. Agency is the concept of what I like to call deliberate motion, something that is leading the action that other parts of the character or object will follow the momentum of. This is usually the first part of the character that I animate, and for characters it's usually the hip or torso bone, also known as the center of gravity. Usually when setting key poses, you'll be setting up primarily deliberate actions by the character. Then, slowly, you start adding in non-deliberate motion to the animation. This is known as drag and follow-through, which I already mentioned a little bit in the previous video. This is usually added or fine-tuned during the splining phase, where you usually have more leeway on where you can place keyframes. This allows for a slight offset in the keyframes to give a more natural follow-through. Now, if you don't already know about the basic concept of inertia and momentum, a quick rundown of that is an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and an object at rest tends to stay at rest. This means that whenever you move the part of your character that has agency, the child bones of that part of the character will start out not wanting to follow, and thus lagging behind a bit. And then, when that part stops moving, the child bones will want to keep going, overshooting the landing location of the original bone. Now that we know that, I encourage you to start animating the secondary physics bones, such as the hood, the hair, the tail, the ears, and the jacket. Since these are completely separate from any concept of agency, aka they can't be consciously controlled by the character directly, except for maybe the tail, but we won't worry about that for now, they should mostly abide by the law of inertia we described earlier. Let's go through and give this a shot, as it should be pretty simple. Simply find your extreme poses where the parent bones of these bones are changing direction the most, and then animate your overshoots and lags as necessary. And once you've done that, you should have a completed run cycle. However, you may notice that it doesn't loop perfectly, especially if you haven't placed keyframes exactly on the start and end frames for certain poses. Let's go ahead and clean this up by inserting keyframes for the whole character on the beginning and end poses. Make sure that the beginning and end poses are still identical at this point by copy-pasting the pose, and make sure the middle pose is still a perfectly mirrored version of the end poses. We can then delete all keyframes outside the frame range if applicable. From there, we can change our start frame from 0 to 1 so we don't see the same pose twice in our loop. This should give us a clean loop. Now, this is pretty good, but if you wanted to use it in a scene, you would have to loop it over multiple frames, not just the frame range of the cycle. In order to do this, we can simply add an F-curve modifier to every single one of our curves in the graph editor. Simply go to the graph editor, make sure selected only is turned off and show hidden is turned on, or that you have all the bones you want to loop selected. Then press Alt-H to make sure all the curves are visible. Then press A to select all the curves. Go to Channel, Extrapolation Mode, Make Cyclic. This will automatically add a cyclic modifier to every single one of our F curves. For hotkey users, you can press Shift-E to access the same menu. And if you want to remove these cyclic modifiers at any time, you can click Clear Cyclic. Now that we've done that, we can actually extend the frame range as far as we want, and the loop will continue. Now before we finish, let's wrap this animation up in a bow and label it. To do this, we'll want to switch from the dope sheet to the action editor. This can be done by selecting Action Editor from the drop-down menu here at the top left-hand corner of the dope sheet. The Action Editor only shows us the keyframes associated with the currently selected active object, and also allows us to name the animation for that object. So let's end this module by renaming the action to something identifiable such as Run Cycle, which will come in handy later. In the next module, we'll be going over the advanced animation, talking about how to create this specific parkour chase sequence. So far, we've taught you what you need to know to make an animated loop. In the next video, we'll be talking about how to set up your file for an animated short in Blender. Now that we know the process of animating in Blender, let's apply that in a way that helps us create an actual animated sequence. For that, we'll be creating a parkour chase action sequence that involves two characters, one chasing the other, through an alleyway. To do this, we're going to want to set up a file to a point where we can start animating. So let's start with a fresh file. First, open Blender and delete the default cube. Then let's go ahead and import the environment. We can do this in a very similar way as we imported the character rig earlier. Simply go to File, Append, navigate to your blend file, double-click it, go to Collection, and select BG Alleyway. This should import the full environment that we prepared for you for this project and should look something like this. If in the future you ever need to find yourself in need of an environment or character to animate with, I recommend checking out blendswap.com. Next, let's go ahead and import the character again into our fresh file as well. File, Append, navigate to our character file, Collection, Character Rig. Once we have our character rig and our environment, we can go ahead and move them into separate collections for easy organization. For example, let's rename this default collection to BG and then create a new collection by right-clicking in the outliner and selecting New Collection. We can then rename this new collection to be char or car for character, and let's go ahead and simply left-click drag the character rig collection to be under the car collection. This might seem a bit redundant, but it will come in handy once we add more props and characters. For now though, we'll be sticking with just one character and adding the second one later. Now, before we move on, we'll probably want to import the run cycle that we made earlier so we can use it for this section. To do that, you'll also want to use the File Append feature. Navigate to your blend file with the run cycle and go to Action. Then select the action associated with the character rig we used to animate the run cycle. If you renamed the action in the run cycle file earlier, it will likely be named Abby Run Cycle or something similar. From here, let's make sure our character armature object is selected in the 3D viewport, and then we can go to the dope sheet, change it to Action Editor, and select our newly appended run cycle action from the drop-down list. And if we press spacebar, you'll see that the character is now showing the run cycle animation we made earlier. We'll come back to how to edit this animation later. And for those of you who are curious when to use the Action Editor and when to use the dope sheet, it comes down to a few things. Most of the time, using the Action Editor is totally fine, as it's really just a dope sheet that only focuses on the keys of the selected object. But sometimes if you want to manipulate several keys over several objects, you must use the dope sheet. So I typically recommend keeping it on the dope sheet with Selected Only turned on, as that's the most useful for most situations. Or if you want to see all keyframes for a specific armature with hidden bone layers, you might want to use the Action Editor with Selected Only turned off. In this situation, however, using the Action Editor is required to access the action drop-down list for the active object. But now that we've done that, I'll be switching mine back to the dope sheet. The next step is to add a camera to our scene. We do already have the default camera, but in case you don't for whatever reason, just remember you can add a camera through the Add menu up here or by pressing Shift-A and going to Camera. The final step is one we haven't gone over before, and that's importing audio. For this particular animation, and for a lot of animations, you may want to have some sort of audio cues to help time the major beats of your shots. In this case, I have prepared a song and some basic sound effects for you guys based on the animation that I will be doing. By importing this audio file beforehand, you'll be able to listen to the audio and time your animation based on it for a good rhythm and flow. To import audio, we'll want to go to the video editing workspace, but you may notice that it doesn't currently exist in our workspace tabs. That's not a problem. We can simply press the plus icon, go to video editing, and select video editing. Here, you'll notice a large timeline-like editor that says sequencer in the top left of the area. Let's use the add function at the top of this editor and select sound. From there, we can navigate to the sound file we provided, and it should import directly into the sequencer. You can use your usual transformation tools to move the sound strip you just imported to the beginning of your timeline. I personally like to use the hotkey Shift left arrow to bring my timeline cursor to the start frame, and then Shift S to snap the strip to the timeline cursor. Before we leave this workspace, we'll also want to make sure that our timeline start and end frames match with the audio we imported. This may not always be the case for your own future projects, but we've prepared this audio specifically for this project, so I recommend doing it. To do that, simply zoom out until you can see the end of the sound strip, unless it's already visible. Then drag the timeline cursor to the last frame of the sound strip and set the end frame to our current frame. You can do that by either copying the frame number in the timeline below, or you can press Shift End. Once we've done this, we can go back to our animation workspace to see if it works. If you press play, you should be able to hear sound now alongside your animation. However, you might notice that the playback rate of the sound and the animation don't exactly match up, and the run cycle is not playing in real time. This is a very real concern since the audio will be playing at a faster rate than the animation. So let's fix that. In order to make sure that the audio matches the animation playback, we'll want to change our playback settings from No Sync to AV Sync via the timeline settings. AV Sync stands for Audio Visual Sync, which will force Blender to match the playback speed in the animation with the audio playback speed, at risk of skipping frames to catch up. And for us, that's totally fine, since we want to prioritize matching the timing over seeing every frame on playback. We can see every frame pretty easily while we scrub through the timeline, but if you ever want to see every frame during playback despite it slowing down, feel free to switch playback back to No Sync. Now, there is a situation where AV Sync may be unusable, and that's if it skips too many frames at once, giving a slideshow effect. This means your scene is too heavy. I recommend a few things to make it play back a bit smoother with a bit more frames, so it's more practical for animation. The first option to try usually is to go to the Simplify options in the render settings. If you turn Simplify on and change the viewport max subdivisions to 0, it should reduce the number of polygons in your scene, speeding up your playback. Another thing to try is to make sure you're animating in solid view. Material Preview is very pretty to look at, but it's also heavier to process. You can change your viewing mode in the top right hand corner with these 4 icons. And if that's still not enough, you can also disable heavy collections that you don't need to see at the moment, such as the background or other characters. I have provided a proxy background asset that you can use instead of the real background, which is a lot lighter for the scene. This can be accessed by appending the BG Low Poly collection from the Alleyway BG file, and enabling that collection and disabling BG Alleyway. You can turn this back when you're ready to render. For this course, the assets provided to you have been optimized to the best of my ability, so hopefully it works on your machine. Some of you may be worried about the crowded nature of this set. Because the buildings surround our character, sometimes it can be difficult to find a good angle where you can see them clearly. To help with this, I highly recommend going to the viewport shading settings here in the top right hand corner and turning on backface culling. This setting is only visible when you're in solid view, but can make a big difference for workspace visibility. As you can see, if you move inside of a building, you will now be able to see through it. In the next video, we'll be talking about how to plan your animation with Grease Pencil and other planning tools. Before we start animating anything, it's usually good practice to plan out your animation in a way where you can reference back to your original plan at any time. One good way to do this is to simply draw a path your characters will take with Grease Pencil. We can do this by adding a Grease Pencil object from the Add menu. I'll be choosing Blank and then going into Draw mode. This can be done similarly to how you enter Pose mode for armature objects. Once here, we can already start drawing onto our scene. The first thing you'll want to decide before you draw with Grease Pencil is what depth at which you draw. You can set what reference point to use as your drawing surface here at the top. The left menu here is for stroke placement, which basically lets you set what depth your stroke should start. Origin is the origin of the grease pencil object we just added, and 3D cursor starts your stroke at the depth of your 3D cursor location. Surface is also great since it allows you to draw onto the surface of objects. You're free to experiment with the other settings. The right menu here is for drawing plane. This controls the rotation of the plane that you draw onto. This is a bit more complex, so I'll leave it at default for now. To start drawing our path, I'm going to be using Surface and View. To control the brush settings for the grease pencil, you can open the right-hand side menu here or press N. Under Tool, you'll see Brushes. You can click on this image to select a different preset for your brush. I'll be using Draw Pencil, but feel free to experiment with whatever you like best. To change the color of your grease pencil strokes, you can simply add a material in the Materials tab. Since we're just drawing a path, I won't bother with this for now, but it might come in handy later. I'm going to go ahead and draw a general path showing that she'll be running along here, then jumping onto this dumpster with a front flip, running forward, vaulting over this fence, and landing. I'm also going to have her do a roll and pick up a spray paint can, and afterwards they'll do a short exchange of blows. Now the path is a good start, but we'll also want to get our timing down for the animation too. Another planning technique that I like to use is to write text-based descriptions of each shot, timed to the music. The easiest way to do this is to use Blender's video editor. If you go back to the video editing workspace, we can use the same sequencer that our audio strip is currently sitting on. Here we can go into the Add menu and select Text. As you can see, a text strip gets placed in the sequencer, allowing you to grab and translate it anywhere you like for timing purposes. You can also grab the head or tail of the clip to shorten or lengthen the duration of the text on screen. To edit the text, simply go to the properties on the right using the N hotkey or this arrow icon, and edit the text at the top field here. And lastly, we can simply change our text size by dragging this size option under Style. A few other settings I recommend is to change alignment to center for both X and Y, and to change location Y to 0.5 to center the text. Wrap Width lets you wrap the text after a certain length, and if you set it to 1, it will wrap it based on the size of the frame. I use this technique to very quickly summarize my ideas for when to switch shots, what camera angles and actions I want, and how everything times with the music. I'm also going to make our text a little easier to read by adding a black color strip in the back here. You can do that by going to the Add menu, going to Color, and dragging it to the bottom row underneath the text strips. If you want to, I do also recommend some camera animation at this stage, but it's not required since we'll also be going over cameras at the end. Personally, however, I enjoy doing a rough camera pass at the beginning as it helps me visualize what I want to animate as an extra layer of detail on top of the text strips. It also has the added benefit of being able to draw poses and framing from the camera view as a sort of storyboard. If you do want to try some camera animation, here are some quick tips. You can animate the camera just like any other object in Blender. However, you can also go into your camera view and animate it directly from there while the camera is selected. While inside camera view, you can press G and then middle click drag to dolly your camera. To switch camera angles during the sequence as if it were a jump cut, simply do a single frame transition, where you have a keyframe for the last frame of one shot and the first keyframe of the next shot one frame after, like so. This will snap the camera from one angle to another with no noticeable transition to the viewer. Sometimes, however, you may want to change your camera's keyframe handle to vector to make sure the interpolation doesn't carry over. One last tip is to use the Align Camera to View tool. This allows you to navigate in the viewport to an angle you like, and then align the camera to your current perspective. This can help you set up your camera work a lot faster. You can access this tool through the View menu. Go to Align View, Align Active Camera to View. Hotkey users can press Ctrl-Alt-Numpad 0. There is one more thing you can do to help make your planning more concrete. Some of you may remember I mentioned storyboarding from the camera view. This can be done by parenting a grease pencil object to the camera, not too far away from the origin of the camera object, but still in view. Then set your grease pencil settings to origin and view respectively. With this, we'll be able to draw some quick poses overlaid onto our scene. If your strokes are too big because they're closer to the camera now, you can press F to change the brush size. Let's draw our first frame. However, when we play our animation, you'll notice that the grease pencil carries over our entire timeline. This is because we haven't added keyframes to our grease pencil yet. We can do this by going to the grease pencil mode under our dope sheet settings. This will show us our grease pencil keys. These keys work exactly the same as other keyframes, except that by default, there is no interpolation between the strokes. Instead, it works more like 2D animation, where each keyframe is a new drawing. If you move your current frame to a different frame, you'll notice that drawing anything in a frame without grease pencil keyframes will replace the drawing from before automatically. So with that, let's add some storyboard drawings to our scene. In the next video, we'll finally start moving our character through our scene. Now that we've had time to plan our character's movement throughout the scene, we can go ahead and start animating some stuff. First and foremost, let's try moving our character as a whole through the scene as we planned. This is what the root bone was made for. The root bone of a character allows us to move the character as a whole without worrying about any other bones lagging behind. So let's select the root bone and start translating it along the path that we determined our character should take. While you can rotate before you start animating, it's important, in my opinion, that we do not rotate or scale the root bone during this process. I think that the root bone works best when used as a translational path, since there may be points later when you move the character away from the root bone, and in those instances, if the root bone rotates, the character pivots in a very unnatural way. So let's just translate our character along the path according to the timing of what we have planned in the sequencer. To reference the sequencer as we're animating, we can go to the top left-hand corner of the left 3D viewport and change the editor type to Video Sequencer. We can then change the view type to Preview. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and start editing our run cycle animation. To do this, we'll need to clear the cycles modifiers so we can loop it manually. To clear the cycles, simply go into the graph editor, turn off Selected Only, and turn on Show Hidden. Press Alt-H to unhide any curves, and then select all the keyframes with the A hotkey. From there, you can press Shift-E and select Clear Cyclic. If you press play, you'll notice that the run cycle only plays once and then doesn't loop after that. This is what we want. Now we can manually loop the keyframes. I think the easiest way to do this is to simply turn off Selected Only in the Action Editor. Turn on Show Hidden, lock the channel for the root bone, select all the keyframes using the A hotkey, and then duplicate all of these keyframes with Shift-D. You can then move them along the timeline so that the first frame of the duplicated loop overlaps with the last frame of the original loop. This will loop our animation one extra time manually. And we can repeat this process however many times we need to for however long our character will be running for. I'm going to repeat it until she needs to start jumping to get on top of the dumpster here. From this point, I'm going to start animating as I normally would, setting key poses, blocking, splining, and polish. While we watch this time lapse, I'll share with you a couple things I like to keep in mind while animating. When animating a new pose from a previous pose, I recommend moving the center of gravity, or the torso bone in this case, before anything else. This is because the center of gravity is typically the bone with the most agency in humanoid characters. This will allow you to see the momentum of the character much more clearly, as everything else follows that movement, making it easier for you to see the pose you need to make for that movement to make sense. Thus, once you understand this and start moving the hip control before other bones, all you need to do after that is to keep in mind weight, balance, and momentum. I do also recommend reference, as it is not easy to get those things right either, but everything your character does outside of acting choices should be to offset weight, keep balance, or react to momentum. Also keep in mind the 12 principles of animation, such as squash and stretch, which will allow you to exaggerate certain motions for extra clarity should you need it. And of course, a final tip, as I mentioned before already, is to use reference. It may not always be possible to find reference online of the exact movement you're looking for. But the greatest reference you often have is your own body. Imagining yourself performing the movement you want your character to do also works as a great base. But better yet, if you have a camera, webcam, or phone, you can easily record yourself performing the move in question in some fashion, without hurting yourself. Then import that video as reference. But looking up reference online is always a safe bet to try if you can't do the move yourself. For example, parkour has great reference if you just look up parkour videos on YouTube. I used several parkour videos as reference when I animated this sequence, so I recommend you do as well. In the next video, I'll be finishing the animation to a point for this first character. The rest of the animation for this character is up to you. I'm going to keep it relatively simple and have her just continue running forward. Then I'll have her roll and pick up this spray can here to use as a weapon. For this video, I'll show you my time-lapse of how I animated this and discuss a few techniques that I personally use in my animation to get things done. The first thing you'll notice that you may have been wondering about in my previous time-lapses is that the legs are often stretched and left behind during certain parts of the process. And we did talk a little bit about this in the previous video. This is because I like to animate using a technique called layered animation. This means animating a single part of the character completely, whether it's a specific motion or scene, before animating any other part of the character. Typically, this means animating the hip, or cog, aka center of gravity control, to get your character's weight and balance animated first. This can be particularly helpful for running and flipping movements. After you get the cog animated, which for our character is the torso bone, you'll be able to start animating the legs, as well as the upper body. Eventually, you work your way down to the head and the fingers. This is a different process from pose to pose, and is more similar to animating straight ahead. The difference between these is a principle of animation. Pose-to-pose animation is a method of animation similar to what we did for the run cycle video. You choose your key poses first, and then refine the animation from there with in-betweens. Straight-ahead animation is a method of animation that involves less planning and more doing. This means instead of choosing key poses, an animator simply creates the next pose they want to make as they need them. This does have advantages. It can be faster and more flexible, but it's also more difficult and can sometimes result in doing more work if you ever have to redo things. This is simply because straight ahead doesn't let you preview your entire animation before you finish too many drawings like pose to pose does. By the way, the reason why I said drawings is because pose to pose and straight ahead were techniques invented for 2D animation. Now, of course, they still apply to 3D animation, but layered animation is a bit of an in-between, where you can animate a single part of the character fully first, and then animate another part of the character based on the foundation of movement. For example, if you already know how your character's torso is going to move, that makes it much easier for you to figure out how to move their chest or legs by following simple rules of balance and inertia. Hopefully this makes sense, but also don't worry if you feel lost. Animation is a very complex topic that I won't be able to cover in a single video. However, I do hope that we can teach you the tools you need in this course, so you'll be fully equipped to build upon your animation knowledge in the future. One last tip before we finish off this animation. The head bone has a property called head follow. This allows the animator to have the head inherit the rotation of the rest of the body, or to ignore it. I typically have it off for Tabby, because in the real world, people tend to stabilize their heads while they're running. This does mean, however, that I have to rotate the head manually a full rotation whenever she does a flip or a roll like she does here. This property is ultimately up to situational preference, and I recommend you play around with it. You can also keyframe it if you want. When deciding which setting to use, keep in mind your goal for most animation tools is to save time. Now, you might be wondering, how much should I animate at this stage? For our purposes, we'll be duplicating this character's animation for the second character later. For this specific situation, you should want to animate until you reach a point where you feel like both characters will stop sharing similar animation. For me, that's going to be when they start fighting. Before I finish up this animation, I'm going to have the character pick up a prop halfway through the sequence. I'll show you guys how to do that in the next video. While our character is being chased through the alleyway, I want her to pick up this spray can here so she has a weapon to use against the girl who's chasing her. Keep in mind, we haven't animated the girl that's chasing her yet, but I already know in my head that's what I want. So, since we've already animated her doing a roll here and doing the motion of picking up this spray can, let's figure out exactly how we can get the spray can to stick to her hand dynamically. The best way to do this is to use constraints, specifically the child of constraint. With this, we can do something called dynamic parenting. In other words, this child of constraint allows us to keyframe its influence, turning it on or off whenever we need to. So, how do we add a child of constraint? Well, firstly, let's scrub to the frame right before we want the spray can to start following the character's hand. We'll go ahead and insert a keyframe for the spray can on this frame so that it stays there until the character picks it up. Then we can go forward one frame and select the spray can, then click the blue constraints icon in the properties panel. Here we can select child of constraint from the drop-down menu. Since we want to parent the spray can to the hand bone of the character, let's go ahead and fill this parameter using the armature object of the character rig. Then we can select the hand bone for the bone parameter. However, you might notice that the spray can has disappeared completely. That's just because it's snapped to a totally different location after taking the transformation of the character into account. To negate this, simply press the Set Inverse button, which brings the spray can back to its original location while preserving the constraint. Let's insert a Lockrot scale keyframe for the spray can here as well. The last thing we have to do now is keyframe the influence for the child of constraint. Right now the influence is at 1.0 or 100% for the whole animation. But what we want is for the influence to be 0 before this frame and 1.0 after this frame. So let's go ahead and right-click the influence slider and select Insert Keyframe. It should turn yellow to signify that there is now a keyframe on this frame, and then let's move one frame backwards in time and insert another keyframe on the influence slider, but this time we drag it down to 0. If you have auto keyframe on, you just have to drag the value and it will add a keyframe automatically after adding the first one previously. If not, dragging it and inserting a keyframe manually works too. For hotkey users, you can also press I while hovering over the influence slider. This should work for keyframing any field, slider, or parameter outside of the 3D viewport, unless otherwise specified. Now, when we play back our animation, the spray can should be resting before that frame, and then following the hand perfectly after that frame. But you may notice that it doesn't fit perfectly into the character's hand, and that's where you can take some creative liberties, keyframing the spray can so that it moves slowly into position before the viewer notices. Dynamically unparenting an object goes a bit like this. First, go to the frame where you want to start letting go of the object. Set a Lockrot scale keyframe for the object, and set a keyframe on the influence slider for 1.0. Then go to the next frame and press the X button next to the influence slider. This will turn off the influence but preserve the transformation of the object. You can then insert a keyframe for the influence slider for 0.0 and a Lockrot scale keyframe for the object. But all in all, if you want to make this process a little bit easier, there is also a dynamic parenting add-on for Blender 2.8, which is free, which I'll provide in the link down below. Learning how to use that add-on will also prove useful. I'm going to go ahead and stop this animation before I plan some character interaction, as we'll need to bring in a second character for that. So we'll be going over that in the next video. Now that we have the animation for the first character done, we can start animating the girl chasing her. To get a head start on this, we can simply begin by duplicating our main character and offsetting the animation. How do we do this? Well, we can't just duplicate the armature object because that doesn't bring any of the character meshes with it. So we're going to have to reappend the character from the source file. We can do this with File, Append, navigate to your blend file, go to Collection, and click Character Rig. This will import a new collection called characterrig.001. Now if you don't see this, it might be hidden inside of your other character rig collection. If so, just make sure to drag it into the car collection, which will take it out. I'm going to go ahead and rename our first collection Tabby, and rename our second collection Abby. To offset the animation of our first character, we need to first duplicate the keyframes from the first character rig over to our second character rig. The fastest way to do this is to simply go to the action editor. First, we'll select Tabby and copy the name of the action in the action editor. Then we can select Abby's rig, which is our newly imported rig, and select the action by the same name in the action editor drop-down menu. This will allow the two rigs to share keyframes. However, we do want to edit the animation for one but not the other, so let's make sure to press this To button. This will essentially copy all the keyframes from the first rig to the second rig. From here, we can offset the animation by making sure that Selected Only is turned off and Show Hidden is turned on. Then we can simply select all the keyframes with the A hotkey and drag all the keyframes in the action editor to the right, so that this second character starts her animation much later than the first character does. I'm going to offset her animation by about 24 frames, so that she starts moving approximately 1 second behind Tabby. Great! As we play back our animation now, you can see that it already feels a bit like a chase sequence, with Tabby leading and the chaser following shortly behind with the exact same path and moves. To differentiate them, I'm going to be selecting Tabby's root bone, and go to the bone properties panel on the right here. Here we can find a color swap property. For Tabby, I want this number to be 1. If this number is green or yellow for you, you can right-click it to clear keyframes, which will ensure that the value will not change through the animation. We can see what the colors look like by going into Material Preview mode. I also want Tabby to be wearing a hood, so I'm going to go ahead and select the Hood Master Bone and press Alt-R. This will bring the hood back onto the head. You also want to make sure to delete all keyframes in the action editor for that bone. Alright, so this is not bad, but they are a bit too much in sync. Obviously, we don't want them to do the exact same thing, especially when they overlap like this. So in the next video, we'll be finishing the animation by editing the second character's movement to match what we want. Animating two characters interacting is an important aspect of character animation, and we'll be focusing on a short fight scene that dives into how this can be done. Before we get started, it is a good idea to plan out the fight scene to a certain extent. When planning out a fight choreography like this one, you'll typically be doing character actions and character reactions one after the other. The easiest way to animate it is to switch between the characters as you do actions and reactions. So first, you animate one character performing a leading action, usually an attack of some sort in the case of fight choreography. Then you switch over to the other character to animate the reaction to the said action, which is usually blocking or dodging the attack, but sometimes getting hit. Now here's a quick tip regarding switching between characters while animating. Normally, if you go into pose mode for one object, you won't be able to select bones of another armature without going back into object mode. This can be very tedious, so one trick that makes animating multiple characters easier is simply going into pose mode for more than one armature at a time. To do this, all you have to do is select both armatures before entering pose mode, and now all the bones will be selectable at once. Now that we know that, let's plan out our choreography. Keep in mind the character action and character reaction. Mix it up a bit so it isn't too predictable, but keep it within a rhythm so that it feels satisfying to watch. Personally for me, I'll be having Tabby aim her paint spray can towards Abby, with Abby blocking the spray with her hands. Abby's goal now should be to disarm Tabby, so she performs a double kick. One kick will be aimed at the spray can to disarm Tabby, and the other kick will be aimed at Tabby's face. This is where knowing what kind of moves are possible in martial arts comes in handy. From here, Tabby will need to be animated getting hit. This gives Abby time to continue going on the offensive, so she runs up behind Tabby to block her exit. At this stage, she should yell, "That's mine," as she punches Tabby. We'll be going over lip sync in another video. However, to make the fight more equal, Tabby should be able to block this attack. We'll accomplish that with a simple hand and fist block. That's the end of this short exchange, which we'll expand upon in the final video, but that should give you a good idea of how to plan a fight choreography. Now that we have that part planned out, let's go ahead and start animating. For the most part, this is pretty straightforward, but you'll want to make sure that the hits are convincing. A lot of making a hit convincing is in the reaction of the character. Both in animation and live action, there's a lot of exaggeration in how a character reacts that signifies to the viewer how powerful a hit might be. It's also important to add a convincing amount of anticipation to the character attacking to build up power behind the attack. But add too much and it makes the fight feel too choreographed, since their attacks would be too obvious and too easy to dodge in a real fight. Here I'll mention a few more tips that I used while animating this sequence. One very useful advanced feature of Rigify is the Rig UI here. In these settings, you can not only turn on and off bone layers, but you can also change the parent of the IK bones dynamically. This is a very powerful tool that lets you change the transformation space of any of the IK bones. For example, if you want the IK hands to follow the chest bone, I can go here with the IK hands selected and select the chest bone from these drop-down menus. This means that whenever you rotate the chest, the hands will follow that rotation. If you want to switch the parent to world space, you can select None from that list as well. This means that the hands will transform separately from the other bones, allowing for certain kinds of transformations as well. For example, if the characters use their hands to lift themselves off the ground, you would not want the hand to move when you move the torso. Another note about this tool is that it sets a keyframe for the property, but the keyframe resides on those gear-shaped bones at the shoulders and thighs. Make sure to select those bones to view the dynamic parent keyframes in the dope sheet or action editor. Another tip I have is regarding a workflow technique. One thing that I'm taking advantage of here is knowing exactly when and where I want to cut my camera. This will be made easier if you have camera work done already by this stage. However, even though I haven't done cameras, thanks to my text boards, I know approximately when my camera will be cutting to a different part of the scene. This means that during that cut, I can change the animation or position of my character suddenly, and thus the viewer won't be able to tell that it doesn't line up perfectly. You can see this in when I cut to Abby's double kick, and also when Abby moves around Tabby to punch her. With this, you can cheat and save a lot of time by knowing what will be visible in the shot and what won't be visible in the shot. So, while this may look strange from afar, the camera, and thus the audience, will only be able to see what we want them to see. A quick tip for getting blocks to feel more convincing is to use vector handle types. By doing this on contact frames, this will help make the momentum of the attacker and defender cancel out perfectly, making the block feel more powerful, assuming you also include some follow-through afterwards. In the next module, we'll be going over some facial animation to sweeten our action sequence. Now that we've gotten the body mechanics mostly finished up, it's time to focus on the facial animation. For me, this usually starts with the eyes. What you'll want to do first is determine where your character wants to look at any point in the animation. So let's do a quick pass where we animate the character looking towards the direction she's going, focusing on key props or locations relevant to the action she's about to take. For example, when she picks up the spray can, she should look at it before grabbing it. You most likely already accounted for these things with the head animation, but in case you didn't, you want to move the character's head to accommodate the need to look in certain directions as well. I've added a few times where the character looks behind her too, to check on her chaser's progress. The animation of moving the eyes to look left, right, or other locations is called eye darts. One thing to keep in mind when doing eye darts is that you'll want to make sure the eyes move very quickly from one pose to another. Since the human eye can't actually pan slowly, it can only focus on one point at a time, you should animate the eyes with a very quick transition, about 1 to 2 frames, between poses. This means even if your character is scanning an area left to right, the eye should jump from one point to the next. Make sure you keep this in mind when animating the eyes. Another tip is that when staring in a single direction for a long time, it might be more interesting to have the eye dart slightly. In other words, you could have the eyes look forward, but then dart slightly to the left, then slightly up, then slightly back towards the original location. This adds personality to the eyes, showing that they're actively taking in information. The next layer of eye animation is to add blinks. Blinks are relatively simple to animate as well, but can add a lot of personality to the character. Choosing when and how fast to blink can tell the audience a lot about a character subconsciously. So, how do we animate a blink? My go-to formula is to simply set a keyframe for the starting open eye pose, then close the eyes maybe 20%, then close the eyes all the way, then open the eyes maybe 20%, and then finally open the eyes fully. This is about 4 keyframes. Then I would usually copy these keyframes throughout the dope sheet to place blinks very easily throughout my animation. For this animation, I'll be focusing mostly on a few types of blinks. The first type of blink is the passive blink, which is a simple blink where there just hasn't been enough eye movement for a while. The second is an eye dart blink. This is a blink that coincides with an eye dart, especially for the more extreme eye darts where the eyes move a far distance at once. In fact, you should always add a blink for very extreme eye darts if you can, unless a blink has already happened too recently. This helps smooth out eye dart motions, and is a blink humans naturally tend to do. And the third type of blink is a reactionary blink to certain actions. For example, whenever our character's head gets too close to an obstacle or prop, she should blink or close her eyes for a bit. The fourth and last kind of blink category should be a broader acting blink, which simply tells some sort of emotion that you might want to convey. For example, I might have the character blink rapidly for a bit, which makes her look uncomfortable and scared about the current situation. Other than blinks, there are also squints. These are used for times where the character wants to focus on something or wants to close their eyes slightly. For me, I'll be doing some squints to make our characters seem a bit more determined. That concludes the basic concepts behind eye animation. So now we can move on to eyebrow animation. Evolutionarily, eyebrows seem to exist almost solely as an emotional expression tool. Very few animals naturally have eyebrows, but humans naturally use eyebrows to express a wide range of emotion: angry, sad, worried, confused, surprised, etc. Let's go ahead and do a quick eyebrow pass for our animation as well. For the most part, I'll be furrowing Abby's brows in a concerned look, to show that she's concentrating on getting her stolen item back. Tabby's eyebrows might be a bit more playful. Meanwhile, parkour is a very intense sport, and requires utmost concentration since any mistake could injure the user. So we'll keep a furrowed brow as the default state for both of them anyway. From there, we can add a few flourishes that help accent the rest of the animation. For example, whenever humans look left or right, their eyebrows tend to raise with a bias towards the direction they're looking, almost as if to open the eye a bit more. This is a common technique to follow the line of action in animation, and helps exaggerate poses. So let's go through and synchronize our eyebrows with our eye darts. Whenever our character looks left, have the left eyebrow raise a bit higher than the right eyebrow. Whenever the character looks up, have both eyebrows raise, and whenever the character looks down, lower the eyebrows a bit, etc. This will help sell the eye darts even more, and can help make the character feel more alive. You can also parent a camera to Tabby or Abby's head bones, and watch their face as they animate more clearly. To look through this camera, simply set it as your active camera by pressing Ctrl Numpad 0. In the next video, we'll be showing you how to animate the mouth to show different emotions and exertion. Mouth shapes for an animation, aside from lip sync, usually have to do with acting choices. So we'll mostly be focusing on exertion, aka breathing and clenching teeth, and emotion. For the most part, both Abby and Tabby should probably have their teeth clenched as they run. Tabby could be smiling as Abby is frowning. However, once each one starts doing anything like jumping or recovering, they should take a moment to look slightly tired, which includes taking a deep breath through their mouth. For that, we'll want to have the mouth open in a shape that's easy to breathe with, such as an O shape. The mouth rig has an easy-to-use phoneme control that we'll also go over in the lip sync video. We can use this for a simple O shape. Make sure that it isn't too long vertically so it feels relaxed. If you want to show some more visible frustration, clenched teeth with the lips raised accomplishes this very well. Raising the lips to bare the teeth can be a mouth shape you can use when Abby gets a bit more stressed that her target is getting away, for example. You can do this with the phoneme shape control as well, or the bones on her lips. There is also a jawbone if you want to finesse the opening of the mouth yourself. For the most part, this process should be pretty straightforward. Like any acting shot, you'll want to reference your own reactions to what they're doing in the shot. For here, you'll want to see what kind of mouth shapes you would do in that situation and try to mimic that. For those animators who are more comfortable with acting, you will also have more success getting into character and having more accurate reference. In the next video, we'll be going over lip sync, which will be a more complex version of mouth animation. You may have already noticed, but the audio that we provided also includes a quick piece of dialogue when Abby yells at Tabby during the fight scene.
Get it back!
This times approximately with when she launches the first surprise attack. We're going to do a quick pass of lip sync for this line. The idea for lip sync is pretty simple. We have a phoneme control on the rig that gives you control of 6 different phonemes, or mouth shapes. I call them the MPB, the E, the O, the U, the FV, and the pucker mouth shapes. Additionally, there are 2 controls built into the scale of the master phoneme bone. Scaling the phoneme control larger along the Z-axis lifts the center of both lips, and scaling along the Y-axis curls the tongue into an L shape. With these, it should be possible to animate the phrase, "give it back," or any phrase, with one bone. As a general rule for lip sync, I highly recommend trying to say and form these words for yourself as you animate to get a reference of what your mouth should look like for each sound. Having a mirror or camera can also help so you can physically see the shape you're making. Before we get started, I highly recommend turning on audio scrubbing in the timeline settings. This will let you hear the audio while you scrub through the timeline, allowing you to time the lip sync to the voiceover perfectly. You can do this by pressing the playback dropdown and enabling audio scrubbing. I'll quickly walk you through my own thought process in case it helps. To start off, we'll want to make the G sound, which is really just a slightly open E shape. Then we'll want to do the V sound, which is part of the FV shape. From there, we have the IT sound, which is simply an open E and a closed E shape in quick succession. Then a B shape, which is a tightly closed mouth using the MPB shape, which then leads to an explosive A sound for back. This is essentially an open mouth, like the O shape, but slightly wider. Then you would end with an open E shape for the CK, and if you play it back, you should get "give it back." Anytime you do lip sync, just reference your own mouth and you'll do great. And if you can't do that, find a friend or look online.
Get it back!
In the next video, we'll talk a bit more about effects and how they can sweeten your animation. Effects can be a very important part of making an animation feel impactful or unique. They're not always necessary, but having them can set you apart from other animators. If you do want effects, however, you'll want to make sure that you consider them before animating so you know how to make your character react to them if need be. Some effects may be a conscious choice by the character, such as purposefully spraying a can of paint into the eyes of their enemy. However, for most effects, it's a reaction of the environment to the character's movements. We'll be going over how to quickly execute those effects with simple assets in 2 ways: 2D animated cards or particle systems. For those of you who are wondering, fluid, fire, and smoke simulations are available in Blender, but they're not super practical for stylized animations like the one we're making. But if you're interested in those effects, there are tons of resources available online to teach you how to use those as well. In the next video, we'll go over how to use 2D animated cards, which are basically 2D animations on image planes in our 3D scene. The most basic type of effect is smoke or dust. And like I said earlier, we don't want to use smoke simulations for this style. So how do we accomplish this effect without simulations? Well, I personally prefer 2D cards, as I think they're the most effective way, being stylized and very lightweight. But how do we create 2D effects cards? Well, the first step would be to learn how to 2D animate, and that's not very practical for most people. So in reality, buying 2D animation packs is one of the best ways to do it. Luckily, however, we've provided 2 free 2D animated cards you can use for your own projects, including this one. I won't go too into the process of setting up 2D cards, but you're welcome to dissect the original Blend files where they'll be appended from. It dives deeper into the shading aspect of Blender, which we don't go over in this course. But anyway, let's go ahead and append both of these cards using the File Append function. Navigate to your file and double-click it. However, instead of importing the collection, I recommend just importing the object. This is because it's the only object in the file. Once you import these 2 planes, you'll notice that when you select them, they have keyframes set already for their animation. This is most apparent in the action editor. Because they've been set up for you this way, it makes it very easy to adjust these keyframes to show where you want the effects to happen. In order to see the effects, you'll want to go into Material Preview, which will allow you to see the actual texture of the planes. We can also, of course, transform this plane in any way to place it in our scene. For me, I'll want to place the Dust card wherever our main character touches something dusty with enough force. This includes the ground. So, for example, when she vaults over the fence and lands, we can place a Dust card facing the camera to emphasize the impact of the landing. I'll be using the Spray card for the spray can effect. Simply parent the card to the spray can with Ctrl P. You'll also want to keyframe the rotation of the plane to face the camera. Then drag the animation of the Animate keyframes to fit the timeline where Tabby chooses to spray. Feel free to use your own judgment for this process and change up the timing of the keyframes if you need to. In the next video, we'll be going over particle simulations and how to create simple ones for your animation. Particle systems are a very powerful simulation tool in Blender. They allow the user to generate multiple instances of an object and apply basic physics to those instances. I personally use them very often for effects of all kinds. For our situation, I think they would be good for debris, like during this impact here. To do this, I'll give you a quick overview of particle systems. The first thing we'll want to do is create an object to reference as the particle later. For this example, we'll be wanting to create a generic rock particle. The fastest way to do this is to add a UV sphere. Let's rename it to Rock Particle. Then go to the Modifiers tab and add a Decimate modifier. You can then drag the ratio slider as far down as you can to a point where you get a decent debris-like shape. It doesn't have to be very high poly. Just good enough to look like a pebble or rock from a distance. Once we've done that, we can apply the Decimate modifier. That's pretty much it. So we'll just add a quick shader by stealing the shader of whatever surface we want to pretend the rocks came from. So if it's the street, simply select the street material from the dropdown. If it's the brick, just select the brick material from the dropdown. You can then scale the UVs in edit mode using the UV editor to adjust the size of the texture. Once we get that done, we can add a plane, which is where the particles will spawn from. Let's place the plane and shape the plane to approximately where we want the impact to happen. To add a particle system to this plane, we can go to the particle system icon in the properties panel here. Then, once there, we can add a particle system by pressing this plus icon. Now, there are a lot of particle settings, and I won't be going over each one. So I'll just say that to get simple debris particle effects, I recommend these settings. Number is the number of particles, and should be relatively low, like 20 or 200, depending on how many rocks you want. The frame start and frame end should be the same frame number, as the debris should pop out from a single moment of impact. For us, we'll want to match it to the frame where the impact happens. Lifetime can be something short as well, such as 5 or 15. This represents the number of frames each particle should exist for. Velocity is one of the more important aspects. This affects not only how fast a particle travels, but also which direction. For a simple radial explosion of debris, you'll likely want to turn the randomized number to a number between 2 and 5, and the normal number to 0. but for more specific situations, you might want a more directional burst. There's a few ways to do that, but in our case, the easiest way to do it is to increase the normal velocity and rotate the plane so that it points the particles in the right direction. You can also decrease the randomized velocity a little bit to make sure the particles are going mostly forward. Feel free to tweak this until it feels right. And the next step is to finally replace the current particle dots that we see here with the specific object that we made earlier. To do that, we'll go into the render options of the particle system settings and change render as from halo to object. Then we'll fill the object parameter with the rock particle object we created earlier. However, you'll likely not want to render the plane that's emitting the particles, so we'll also uncheck Show Emitter in the render settings. If you also don't want to see the plane in the viewport, you can also uncheck Show Emitter in the viewport settings. At this point, it should already feel pretty decent, but there are 3 more things you can do to polish it up. Firstly, you can make the size of the particle more random in the same particle render settings. You can also change the size of the particles as a whole in case you need bigger or smaller particles than the default value. The second thing you can do is add a random rotation to each particle to make it feel more natural. This is done in the rotation section of the particle settings. Enable rotation and slide the randomize slider all the way up. And finally, you can also add a texture to the particle system to influence the size of the particles so that they get slowly smaller and disappear more organically. You can do this by scrolling down to the texture section in the particle settings and add a texture from there. Then you can click this icon to go into the Textures tab. From there, you'll want to use these settings. Change the type from image to blend. Change the coordinates from generated to strand/particle. Change influence by disabling general time and enabling size. Then go to colors and enable color ramp. From there, you'll want to create a ramp that looks like this. You can do this by simply changing the colors of the ramp, dragging the positions of the colors, and then inserting new colors along the ramp with the plus icon. Now, if we play our animation back, you can see that our particles spawn and then disappear organically. Once you're happy with your particle system simulation, you can actually bake it so it doesn't change and it plays back faster. You can do that by pressing the Bake option in the cache settings. And finally, we can go ahead and drag this rock particle mesh somewhere where we can't see it. We do have to keep the visibility on so that the particles render, but we don't want it to obstruct our scene. I'm just going to drag mine underground where I know the camera will never look. And with that, you should be able to create similar particle systems for each instance of a debris particle effect you might want to make. However, there are some important notes to keep in mind. 1, you can reference the same particle object in multiple particle systems, so no need to make another object unless you want to add more variety. And 2, when duplicating a mesh with a particle system on it, it will not duplicate the particle system. It will have a reference to the original particle system on it, which means that editing the particle system settings will overwrite the previous particle system settings as well. You'll want to press the 2 next to the particle system name to create a separate duplicate of the particle system to start editing it without affecting other particle systems you may have already finalized. I hope you have fun adding particle systems to your scene. In the next video, we'll be going over the finalization process for our animation, starting with a final camera pass. This video will be about camera work, and I know some of you already did camera work at the beginning of the planning stage. However, I do want to go over some basic ideas of camera work and how to make it look good for those who already have camera work and those who didn't do camera work during the planning process. It's important to note that while camera work is helpful for the planning process, it's not necessary to figure out before animating. This is a unique quality of 3D animation. 2D animation, in comparison, requires the viewing angle of the characters to be figured out before even drawing the first frame. Now, regardless of whether or not you did camera work already, I'd love to go over a few camera tips that can help with clarity. First and foremost, you'll want to follow the 180-degree rule as best you can. For those who don't know what that is, the basic idea is that you want to make sure the characters' relative positions and the directions they're looking in relative to the camera is consistent with both the world view and each shot. If there are any changes in the direction a character is facing, this should be shown visually before the switch. For example, with Tabby and Abby running in the same direction, it would be weird if we filmed Tabby from this side so she faces screen right, but then cut to Abby being filmed from the other side so she faces screen left. This seems to imply that they're running at each other, which is not consistent with the world view. To fix this, we can simply bring the camera to the same side that Tabby had hers on and film Abby from there so she's also facing screen right. Now, it's important to note that if Abby actually does change the direction she's looking in where she is looking screen left, then we need to show that. If we cut directly to it, it will seem like we broke the 180-degree rule. Why is it called the 180-degree rule? Well, because if you draw a line between the two characters, you're meant to stay on one side of that line, giving you a range of up to 180 degrees. Furthermore, you should always prioritize continuity and clarity. Make sure that every action that is started has a finish that is shown on camera. These things take priority over coolness or prettiness because if the audience doesn't understand what's going on, then any mood or theme you are trying to convey with the camera work will be lost in their confusion. As such, the next thing you should consider on top of that is what kind of mood you might want the audience to experience. For example, we could make this animation feel very tense by keeping the camera low and dynamic. Or we can make the chase feel very whimsical by keeping the camera high and zooming in with some funny sound effects. Decide what kind of mood you're going for and make your decisions based on that while still keeping continuity and clarity in mind. For me, my thought process goes as follows. The first shot is meant to establish the feeling of a chase sequence by making the audience feel like they're trying to catch up to the characters. The next few shots are meant to show both the goal of the characters and their athleticism. I then focus on the spray can to tease what the characters will do next. From there on, my goal is to make the fight feel dynamic and interesting to watch. I'm excited to see what kind of cameras you guys come up with. In the next video, we'll be going over the depth of field effect, which lets you pull your scene in and out of focus through the camera view. So we've already gotten the animation part done, but when we want to show it to the rest of the world, surely we'll want it to look pretty. So let's talk about a few techniques we can do to spice up the render. And the first thing on that list is depth of field. Depth of field, for those who don't know, is when the camera gets blurry for everything except for things at a specific distance from the lens. To emulate this, all we have to do is enter camera view, select the camera, and go into the camera data settings. There we have a convenient depth of field checkbox that we can enable. However, you may not notice anything right away. That's because depth of field is only visible in material preview or rendered view in the viewport. You can access these viewing modes in the top right hand corner of the viewport, or you can press the Z hotkey to access the pie menu. By default, the depth of field is set to focus at a distance specified as a number. Once you have material preview on, you can try moving this value left and right to see how it affects our scene. As you can see, depth of field allows you to focus on a specific distance from the camera. But this might make it difficult to focus on a moving target for several shots. Even if we keyframe the number for each shot, it'd be a bit tedious. So my recommended technique for depth of field is to use the option above focus distance, the focus object parameter. This allows you to automatically set the focus distance to the location of the object you have set. So maybe we can put our character rig object in this parameter so that our camera focuses on our character at all times. But if we do that, it'll prevent us from controlling and fine-tuning the depth of field as we like without moving the character. So I prefer using an empty as the focus object, which we can keyframe easily. To add an empty, simply go into the Add menu and select Empty. I prefer sphere empties so it's easy to spot the empty in our scene. Let's rename this empty to DOF for depth of field, and then we can easily set the focus object of our scene camera to the DOF empty. From there, it becomes very easy to do a simple pass where you move the empty to wherever you want the camera to focus. Pro tip, you can press Shift right-click to snap the 3D cursor to the closest surface beneath your mouse cursor. Then snap your selected object to the 3D cursor with Object, Snap, Selection to Cursor. For hotkey users, you can also use Shift S to access the snap menu. Repeat this process for the whole animation, making sure that the DOF empty is on or near any object you want to focus on. For those who are curious, while there are settings for the depth of field properties in the Render Settings tab, the default max size of 100 is usually fine.
Give it back!
In the next video, we'll be discussing lighting. How do we do lighting? Well, lighting is actually a bit simpler for stylized renders compared to photorealistic renders. I provided you a single light source per character set up in the character rig in the form of a bone. This is how I personally set up character lighting in Eevee for stylized characters. The bone represents the light direction for the character's shader. Now, before we begin, let's go ahead and select our root bone and change the Simplify Custom property to -1. This will help us edit the normals of the face a little bit, which will allow the lighting to be a bit more accurate to what we'll see in final render. A quick pass for lighting for each shot will help you finalize the look you want for your animation. For example, you'll likely want to make sure that each shot has the character's face fully illuminated, although some shots may warrant some more shading or partial shading. For my scene, I'm going to reference the street as the main light source direction. Meanwhile, the rim light color can also be changed to reflect any specific light colors our characters might be standing in front of. For example, the pink of the neon signs can be sampled to influence the rim light for certain shots. We can change the color of the light directly in the bone properties itself, which can be found in the right-hand side toolbar by pressing N in the viewport. Keyframing the rotation of the bone and the color of the light can give you a lot of flexibility. Now, for those of you who are curious, keep in mind that lighting a non-stylized scene will be very different from this, and mostly involves manipulating actual light objects, which you can find in the Add menu. These light objects have their own intensity and color parameters, and you can also select from 4 different types of lights. If you're working on a more photorealistic rendering style, I recommend experimenting with these settings. The next video will discuss how to render our animation both as a preview and a final render. So, how do we get a render of what we animated? Well, fully rendering an animation can sometimes take hours to weeks to finish. So sometimes we just want to have a preview of what the animation looks like without any frame dropping or to share easily. For that, we can do something called play blasting. Play blasting is actually a term borrowed from Maya terminology. In Blender, it's known as viewport rendering. This is basically the process of Blender recording the playback of the frames in the viewport directly to quickly render out a file that echoes what you see in the viewport playback, but with no frame dropping. In order to make a viewport render, let's first go into our camera view so that it renders out the proper angle. Then we can go to the View menu in the viewport and select Viewport Render Animation. You should see something pop up like this. Once it's finished rendering, you may be wondering, where did it go? How do I see it? Well, to view rendered animations, you can simply press Ctrl F11 or go to the Render menu at the very top of Blender and select View Animation. If at this time you see some errors in your animation that you didn't see before, don't worry, that's normal. Play blasting is something that is often done to help get timing down in otherwise heavy scenes. Don't be afraid to adjust the animation while play blasting every once in a while. Now, while seeing this play blast is possible, you might be wondering, where does the file go if I want to send it to someone or import it into a video editor? Viewport renders write out files that go to the render output file path that you set in the output settings. So let's take a look at those settings. We can find the output settings by clicking on the printer icon in the properties panel on the right. Here, you might find an output path that looks like this. We can change this output file location by simply pressing the folder icon and navigating to a folder you wish to output your file to. Make sure to also include a file name in the file path when you're done, like so. I'm going to call this file abby_tabby_fight. The next important aspect is file format. For Playblasts, you'll likely want an MP4 or MOV file or something similar. I personally use these settings here. The file format is the FFmpeg video, the container is MPEG-4, video codec is H.264, and audio codec is AAC. There are plenty of reasons why you should use different file formats for different situations, but we'll go over that in more detail later. With this current output setup, you should be able to press Playblast once again, and this time you'll find your file in the folder you specified. When you're ready to do a final render for your animation, you'll want to understand a few render settings. The most basic ones are as follows. Resolution. Will you be rendering out at 720p, 1080p, or 4K? This is where you decide that. You can also set the resolution to a percentage of the final resolution if you want to render out a test render or something at like 50%. This will render out faster than a full render, so I sometimes do this for Playblasts as well. However, just remember to set it back to 100% for the final render. Next is the file output path. We already went over this one when we set the file output location of the Playblasts. However, the final render and the Playblast share this setting, so one will overwrite the other if they're set to the same folder location and file name. This is important to keep in mind to avoid accidentally overwriting your final renders with a Playblast later down the road. Next is file format, which is very important, as you have several options that could change how you interact with your render. The most tempting might be to render out with an MOV or MP4, even for the final render, since it's the most compact. If you do wish to render out as a video file, I recommend the same settings as I did for the Playblast. However, in my opinion, the best final render settings for an animation is a PNG sequence. The reason for this is because when you render a video file, the file itself is never completed if the render stops halfway, thus corrupting the file and forcing you to re-render the entire animation. However, if you render out a PNG sequence, you can have the render fail or crash anywhere in the sequence and be able to pick up where you left off without losing any progress. After the render finishes, you can still compile the PNGs back into an MP4 file if you wish, but most video editors also accept PNG sequences directly with no issues. For PNG sequences, here are the settings you should use. File format is PNG, and color is RGBA. That should conclude the render settings. All that's left is to show you how to render. To do a final render instead of a Playblast render, all you have to do is press Ctrl F12 or go to the render menu at the very top of Blender and select Render Animation. That will render every frame in your timeline starting from your start frame and ending on your end frame. But some of you may notice your render might go unusually fast and output blank frames or frames of your text boards from earlier. If it doesn't do what you expect, which should be rendering your 3D viewport, one of the first things to check is the post-processing settings. There, if you have sequencer checked, it will sometimes render out your sequencer instead of your viewport if your sequencer has images in it. To fix this, we can simply uncheck sequencer. Now you should be able to press Ctrl F12 and see something like this. And this is pretty good. But there are a few things we can do to make it prettier. We won't go over the rendering effects in this course, but I will say that if you turn on ambient occlusion, bloom, and change the world value to this bluish hue, you're going to get something that looks a bit like this, which in my opinion looks a bit nicer. So we're going to go with that and finish the render. You should use this time to take a water or food break. I mean, you've worked hard at this point, and the render will likely take a few minutes to hours depending on how good your computer is and how long your animation is. If it doesn't turn out the way you expected once it's done, don't worry about it. Just fix up whatever you need to and render it again. In the next video, we'll be going over some extra notes about exporting, how to use PNG sequences, and more. This video is for any extra notes on how to use the things that we exported in case you need it. I personally think, for example, that it's important to explain the best way to use PNG sequences, especially since we're encouraging you to render into that format. So let's make sure everyone is comfortable with using them. Now, I know not everyone is familiar with video editors, but if you are, then importing an image sequence into a video editor is usually quite easy. In Blender, for example, you can just go to the video editing workspace in a fresh file and go to Add, Image/Sequence. Then navigate to the image sequence and select every file that belongs to that sequence. You can use the A hotkey to select all files in a folder, or select one file and then shift select another file to select a range of files. Once you're done, press enter and your sequence will be added to the sequencer timeline as a single clip. For other video editors, such as Sony Vegas, which is what I use, you might have a checkbox option at the bottom to enable image sequence. This will also bring the entire sequence in, and it might ask you for a frame rate to interpret the frames in. Since our animation was animated in 24 frames per second, you should also choose 24 frames per second for this. This will make it so that it matches up to your original timing and the music. Speaking of which, regardless of what editor you use, since we rendered out a PNG sequence, the audio is not included in the render. So you'll have to import that into your video editor separately. For those of you who use After Effects, PNG sequences are also importable there. Overall, PNG sequences tend to preserve quality better than most video codecs that compress the file size, which is why I like to keep them as PNG sequences even when doing video editing. So while they may take up a lot of space on your hard drive, I believe the advantages outweigh the costs. However, if you do need to convert PNGs to MP4 files for any reason, it is very easy to do, and you can do it in Blender. To do this, I recommend simply opening a fresh Blender file and opening a video editing workspace with the plus button at the top. There in the sequencer timeline, you can simply go into the Add menu and add Image/Sequence. Then navigate to your sequence and import it just like we mentioned earlier. Then you can just move the strip to match your start frame and match the end frame with the end frame of your image sequence strip. Then go to the output settings and set your file output path, and then set your file format to FFmpeg and use the MP4 settings I mentioned earlier. Here they are again if you like. Once you've done all that, all you have to do is press Render Animation or Ctrl F12 and voila! You now have an MP4 of your animation. Now, if you want sound included in your MP4 as well, simply import the sound separately into the sequencer and match it to the frame range like we did before. If you render it this way, your MP4 will include the sound file with your animation. It's also important to note that if you don't use a fresh file for the sequencer tricks, you might have your post-processing settings have sequencer turned off, which means that rendering will not render your sequencer output. Just keep this in mind and you'll be fine. In the next video, we'll be going over some final thoughts before we end the course. And that's it. You've successfully completed the course for animation in Blender. With everything that we covered, you should now be able to import characters, import environments, create animations, perform camera work, and add effects. You should also now be familiar with pose mode, setting keyframes, editing keyframes using the dope sheet, graph editor, and timeline, as well as curve editing using the graph editor, and how to render your animation. On top of all that, you created an animation in Blender. Whether or not this was your first animation, this is still something to celebrate. Now it's your turn to start experimenting and making things that you enjoy. Everything that you make from this point forward will have the benefit of the knowledge you now have of how animation works in Blender. This is knowledge that I didn't even have when I started, so I'm sure you'll do great. And if you don't feel like you absorbed everything at once, this course will always be here for you to reference and go back to while you're working on your own projects. Another important note as we finish up this course is that I want to reassure you guys that there is so much more to learn about the art of animation than what's covered in this course. This course is designed specifically to get you started in animation in Blender from a technical standpoint. If you don't feel confident in your animation skills yet, don't worry. That's normal, and now you're even better equipped to learn the art of animation than you were before you learned these tools. Keep pushing yourself to try different animations with the skills and tools you've learned from here, and you'll get there. And remember, use reference. Also, for those of you who don't know, I do have a YouTube channel under the name Dylan Gu where I make fight animations. So if you ever want to see what Blender is capable of with stylized animation, I hope you can find some inspiration in my channel. And if you ever have questions you want to ask me about the course, feel free to join me on my Discord. This is where I spend a lot of my time, so just ask away if you have any questions about the course or Blender in general. And if you're interested in more courses, you should definitely check out Bloop Animation and their online store. I will also be releasing a few Blender tools and assets available for purchase on my online store if you're interested, which is dylangu.com. And all proceeds ultimately help me make more animations. Anyway, thanks so much for watching and participating in this course. It really means a lot to me, and I really hope you learned something. If you ever want to share an animation you make with this course, or just future animations, feel free to tag me on Twitter, @DylanGu. I would love to see more animations of Abby and Tabby, and I'll be on the lookout for any animations you guys create. And a final thank you to everyone who made this project possible.